Coming up next, The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy. Every Thursday from 4 p.m, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Good afternoon and welcome to The Crunch on Reality Check Radio. I'm your host, Cam Slater, and this is the place we crunch the political issues and cut through all the politicians' spin. Today, we're going to focus strongly on the dangers to academic freedom that are the subject of a damning report from the New Zealand Initiative on the dangers posed to this inside New Zealand's universities. I've got the report's author, Dr. James Kierstead, coming on the show for a deep dive into his damning report. And then we'll have a chat with Professor Grant Schofield from the Auckland University of Technology. He wrote the foreword to the report and shares his own challenges he has had inside academia in challenging the orthodoxy. The last guest today is Olivia Pierson, and she will again be sharing Olivia's views with you all. Naturally, we'll hear from Cam's buddies, and we'll see what they have to say about the apparent change in Christopher Luxon, where it appears he seems to have discovered a spine. Of course, we'll have the whale bag to get your feedback too. Don't forget to send comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057. Now, before I get talking with James Kierstead, it's time for a song from Ben Harper, When It's Good. Today, I want to dive into a topic that's been simmering below the surface for quite a while now. But thanks to a recent report from the New Zealand Initiative, which we'll be discussing on this show, it's come boiling to the top. We're talking about academic freedom, the so-called poor cousin of free speech. But if you ask me, it's not just some distant relative in the shadows, it's the canary in the coal mine. And that canary is gasping for air. Dr. James Kierstead and his team have put together a chilling report titled Unpopular Opinions, Academic Freedom in New Zealand. They've meticulously gathered testimonies from 72 academics, analysed surveys, and documented 21 incidents where academic freedom was under siege. And these aren't just isolated events, they're symptoms of a larger problem plaguing our universities. We're talking about a creeping, insidious erosion of the freedom that's supposed to be at the heart of academic inquiry. So what are these threats? Well, the report identifies three main culprits. First, there's the rise of progressive radicalism within universities. And this isn't about left or right politics, it's about a dogmatic mindset that stifles debate and silences dissenting voices. Then there's the elephant in the room, foreign interference, specifically from the Chinese Communist Party. It's no secret that CCP influence has been seeping into our institutions with alarming consequences for academic freedom. And lastly, the managerial, brand-focused nature of modern universities has turned them into a corporate entity more concerned with their public image than with fostering genuine intellectual exploration. But it doesn't stop there. The report also highlights a disturbing trend, the increasing emphasis on safety, not from physical harm, but from words and ideas. And we're seeing a culture where university administrators and student activists treat intellectual debate as a hazard. Now, let me be clear. Students absolutely should be safe from harassment and physical danger. But when we start treating arguments as harmful, we're heading down a dangerous path that will choke off the very discussions that drive innovation and progress. Professor Grant Schofield of Auckland University of Technology, in his foreword to the report, couldn't have put it better. If universities are to remain relevant, nuanced, robust, and open, debate must not only be defended, it must be encouraged. And that's the crux of it. Our universities have a legislated role as the critic and conscience of society. They're supposed to be places where ideas are tested, where conventional wisdom is challenged, and where the future is shaped by free-thinking individuals. But if academic freedom is under threat, what does this say about the health of our society as a whole? In recent decades, the way we access information and express our views has undergone a profound transformation. Social media algorithms create echo chambers, polarizing us more than ever before. And now this polarization is creeping into our universities. The very institutions that should be bastions of free thought are becoming echo chambers themselves, where only certain viewpoints are tolerated. This report is a wake-up call. It's a stark reminder that academic freedom is not just some abstract concept. It's a vital part of our democracy. Without it, we risk stagnation, and worse, we risk the rise of a society where the only voices heard are those that conform to the prevailing orthodoxy. The New Zealand Initiative's report makes it clear. The canary is gasping, and if we don't act now, the air in our intellectual coal mine is going to become unbreathable. We need to fight for academic freedom with the same fervour we fight for free speech, because, in the end, they're two sides of the same coin. Let's make sure our universities remain places of learning, investigation, and debate, where ideas can flourish and where the truth, however comfortable, can still be spoken.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
Dr. James Kierstead from the New Zealand Initiative is the author of a damning report into academic freedom in New Zealand universities. The report is called Unpopular Opinions, and it outlines some alarming details. This report provides a detailed and thoroughly documented examination of the state of academic freedom at our universities, together with an analysis of the main threats to academic freedom in this country at present. Dr. James Kierstead is with me now. Dr. James Kierstead, welcome to The Crunch.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Now, you've authored a report, and I saw this come across my desk, and I thought I really need to talk to you about this. It's a report that you've entitled Unpopular Opinions, Academic Freedom in New Zealand. I think the title describes everything that you're about to tell me, but I want to hear it from your perspective. What this report is about and what we should be worried about in New Zealand.
Well, it's obviously a report on academic freedom. I mean, that much is pretty clear from the title. The unpopular opinions bit, by the way, comes from the Education Act, which says that universities should foster academic freedom, and it partly defines it as the ability to state controversial or unpopular opinions. But yeah, I mean, the main thing we wanted to do for this report was gather the evidence that there is a problem with academic freedom in this country. And I think we found almost too much evidence. I mean, the report kept being delayed because the universities kept doing things that I wanted to include in the report. So at this point, it's about 55,000 words long. It's got 72 anonymous testimonies from academics. We actually had more than that, but we just chose 72. And there were 5 surveys of students and academics that we sort of reanalyzed and put in a big chapter about the surveys. And then there were 21 academic freedom incidents. So these are incidents in which academic freedom was either clearly violated or very much threatened, or, the issue of academic freedom hit the papers for whatever reason. Most of them, as I've just suggested, were already in the public domain and that the press picked them up. But there were 3 or 4 that haven't actually been in the public domain before, so we're kind of publishing them as journalists.
And those ones in the public domain, was one of the ones, the case which ended in a court case with Susie Wiles versus the Auckland University?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. And presumably there's people around the outside of that who were giving you information anonymously about this and the effect that it had on that department or the academics themselves.
I was in touch with a few people who knew about the situation and had their own opinions on it. But actually that one is, as I acknowledge in the acknowledgements inside the front cover, it's one of those incidents that wasn't actually written up by me, it was written up by my colleague, Max Salmon. But I did follow the case myself, and it's a kind of a complicated one because it seems like the judge in the end pretty clearly stated in her judgment that this was not a case about academic freedom. Having said that, the judge also said that one thing that Auckland University tried to do, which was to say that when Susie Wiles was talking, sharing her views on the radio or the TV, that wasn't part of her job at Auckland. The judge also clearly stated that that was wrong on the part of the university, i.e. that when Susie Wiles is sharing her opinions on TV or in the media, that is part of her job, and she can expect the same protections while doing that part of her job as teaching in the classroom.
It was an interesting case because clearly her academic freedom wasn't impinged. She was freely able to go on television and radio and write articles and give her opinion and all of those. It didn't seem to be impeded in any way. What she was most upset about was that she got pushback from for those having those opinions and seemed to think that academic freedom meant you don't get pushback. And I struggled with that.
It's complicated. I mean, I can't remember everything that was all the evidence that was adduced at the trial, but my understanding from people within the University of Auckland was that there were some quite extreme cases. So it wasn't just pushback of the ordinary sort, like I disagree with your opinion. She claims, I think, that there were death threats and fairly extreme threats of that nature. I don't know if they're true. I think that's what she claimed. It's also my understanding from people within the University of Auckland that there was at least one occasion on which somebody came to the university to confront her, and she understandably, I think, found that threatening. However, I think that the university did actually install some added security. I think there was another door which had a sort of swipe card system added to it. So the university claimed that they did actually take reasonable steps to protect her security. And I did read the whole judgment, and the judge does actually, give the University of Auckland credit for responding. She just sort of knocks them down for trying to use the excuse that Susie wasn't really doing her university work on the radio and TV. And I think the judge also criticizes the university for kind of not going far enough in protecting her.
Yeah, I mean, nobody deserves death threats or people confronting you or all of that sort of stuff. But if you're going to be in public and express an opinion, then you should expect that there will be someone disagreeing or dissenting with your opinion. Do you think the academics and the universities have kind of made a rod for their own back in the way that they've built over a number of years an attitude that we can say what we like, but we don't want to hear what anybody says in return?
Well, yes. I mean, if that's their attitude, I mean, I'm not sure that that's the attitude that comes out from the Susie Wiles case. I mean, I think generally, I mean, I was an academic at Victoria University of Wellington. I mean, my sort of personal opinion is that there's a bit of an ideological bubble and that people can sometimes be oversensitive to this kind of thing, to sort of ordinary pushback from, what they would say is kind of beyond the pale politically. But for a lot of people, it's just kind of the normal, the right part, the right is in the right-handed part of the political spectrum. Yeah, but I think in general, I can't think of other cases where people have sort of complained in that manner. Because that's why the Susie Wiles case is so interesting, because it sort of breaks new ground in that sense. And I think that the part of the judge's judgment where she said that, yeah, when you're expressing your views on the radio or on podcasts, you are effectively working as an academic. I think that's going to be significant, and we'll see how far that goes. But I don't think the judge's statement didn't strike me as just saying, for example, you're not allowed to criticize university academics. And I don't think most universities in New Zealand take the view that you're just not allowed to criticize academics. The argument concerns, this more extreme type of criticism, right? And then that's difficult because sometimes I hear these claims about very extreme criticisms and I don't know if they're true, or sometimes people say, well, he said this or they said this, and that strikes me as like not that big a deal. But then other times, things like death threats, rape threats, that kind of thing, I think is clearly beyond the pale.
Well, those are actually criminal. So, I mean, there is ways that you deal with that. It's criminal behavior, death threats and rape threats and all of those threatening person's physical, body. Those are all things that can be dealt with appropriate laws. Anyway, let's put that aside for a bit. In this report, as you said, it's 55,000 words. What do you see as the main threat that this report has revealed, and what you've seen from the evidence that you gathered in producing this report?
So we actually looked at three main threats. One is sort of progressive radicalism on campus on the part of students and university faculty or staff. The other is the Chinese Communist Party, which apparently has been interfering with academia along with sort of other parts of New Zealand life, as people maybe saw in the recent Stuff documentary. And the final threat was what we've called managerialism and the so-called neoliberal university. And this is really universities' tendency to see themselves first and foremost as a brand that needs to be protected. So the combination of that sort of tendency to sort of try and protect the brand at all costs, even from internal criticism, and sort of powerful managers and quite sort of steep managerial hierarchies. That's another one of the big threats. But you did ask me what the biggest one was, so I'm going to have to call it. And I think that the biggest threat at the moment to academic freedom in New Zealand comes from the progressive left. And that's not because I hate the progressive left all the time. I think it has no good points or that it's completely illegitimate. It just so happens that right now there's a massive political skew in most universities in the English-speaking world, far more people on the left than on the right, and that produces certain dynamics. The people who are in the center or on the right come to seem like sort of weird others, and I think there's a lot of psychological elements that when people are in these situations, they have a tendency to kind of marginalize those others and sort of bully them, and I think we see that in universities as well.
Do you think this, let's call it, I think most people will recognize a progressive threat as woke politics, essentially. Do you think that's being driven out of the US and UK and we're sort of like copycatting it, or has it got a life of its own? It's pervasive. It's not just in academia, it's in all society. And we're seeing all sorts of, weird, frankly, positions being taken in the interest of being woke or progressive.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely coming from the States. Mostly, it's also coming from the UK. I mean, the thing about New Zealand, kind of like Canada, where I originally come from, is that it's a small country, and so we kind of look to the bigger countries for what to do. Even if we're doing that just implicitly, the prestigious places like Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge, they set the tone. And I think there's a lot of what you called woke ideas. We kind of tried to avoid that term in the report because it sounds like an insult, but it is a kind of a useful term. So let's say, these far left or these sort of radical progressive ideas, a lot of them are coming out of these prestigious places in North America and the UK. And I think, a lot of academics in New Zealand think, oh, we should be doing that. I think it's complicated because there is also kind of like a New Zealand tradition of progressivism as well. And so, New Zealanders like Linda Smith have actually contributed to post-colonial studies in quite a seminal way. And so in New Zealand, I think that the bit that we've sort of contributed to most on the progressive side of the academic spectrum is post-colonial studies, and especially, stuff about Maori, indigeneity, Maturanga Maori, all of that kind of thing.
It is pervasive. And I wonder how you do, challenge it in many respects. We look at just this year watching Harvard cop an absolute flogging because of, and in fact cost their vice chancellor or equivalent their job in the end because they were trying to justify something that really wasn't justifiable in the end. And it was all around this sort of woke ideology or progressive ideas.
What was the example? Do you remember?
I can't remember exactly the details, but I know that the head of Harvard was questioned, I believe, in a Senate committee, and it ended up all over the media for the diversity policies, etc., and ended up costing her a job.
That was the Israel-Palestine issue, I think, which is kind of an interesting case because people were asking her questions like, should you be allowed to say, basically,
that's right, yes.
It's basically a lot of those statements that the Congress, people in Congress, the representatives were asking about were sort of borderline incitement to violence about Jews. And the president was saying that we should defend people's freedom of speech, which in a sense is the right answer. But it's just sort of spectacularly hypocritical because only a few years ago, we're having the same debates around taboos on the left. and the universities weren't particularly brave about defending free speech.
Mm.
So that is interesting. I mean, I will say on that front that there have been in recent times, like a lot of people on the left being canceled for that kind of opinion, not only in universities, but also outside with the assassination of Donald Trump. People who said that, they would have enjoyed that or something. They're getting fired from their job. So I don't agree with that either.
No,
so that's just proof of what I kind of said at the beginning, right? That like, it's not necessarily that I have a big problem with the progressive left. It's just that they are the hegemonic force at the moment, and they're especially the hegemonic force in universities, and that kind of produces these dynamics.
But where's this coming from? Like, I get asked this all the time. Is there some guiding hand? Is there some sort of master left-wing conspiracy to do all of these things that we're talking about? Or is it just organic and growing a life of its own?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. I mean, you may know that Eric Kaufman has come out with a book recently on this. And his theory is that it's this sort of emergent phenomenon. In other words, it's the product of lots of interactions, lots of individual decisions. It produces this huge uptick in this kind of identity stuff. David Rosado, who's a computer scientist at Otago Polytechnic, he's produced these amazing graphs where he's basically gotten a computer program to scan all the main US newspapers. He's done it in the UK as well, and Spain. And he looks at particular terms. And he's looked at terms like racist, sexist, homophobic. He calls them prejudice-denoting terms. And there's just this huge spike after 2000, actually before 2016, so sort of just before Trump comes in. So it's not completely a reaction to Trump, although Trump seems to sort of poured fuel on the fire. But yeah, I mean, it just sort of shows objectively, I think, what a lot of us have perceived, a lot of us have intuited over the past few years, that there's just been this huge kind of tidal wave of identitarian left ideology and ideas. And yeah, as I say, I don't think there's anyone directing it, because, it almost gives too much credit to any individual to be able to organize it, because it's such a large phenomenon. It's going on not only in the US, but like across the English-speaking world at least, and arguably in some European countries as well. So I think that part of the conditions for that were laid earlier. I mean, I think when I was I did my PhD at Stanford, and when I was there, so that was sort of 2007 to 2013, I felt fine. I didn't think of myself as on the right at that point, actually, but I didn't think that if people were conservative, they would be discriminated against. I didn't think people would be canceled. I didn't think talks would be shut down. But I knew and I recognized that it was a very kind of lefty campus. And I just sort of thought, oh, that I just happened to be at Stanford. Maybe other places are different. And then you sort of start to realize as you go to conferences that, there are some people can be open-minded about a lot of topics as long as they aren't the sort of hot button ones. But on certain topics, it's very difficult to disagree, and you soon find that you're sort of in a minority of one. So that I think that the conditions were really this imbalance that existed before. And for whatever combination of reasons, that would sort of fuel waiting to be lit. And at some point after Trump's, or around the time of Trump's inauguration, somebody threw a match onto that fuel, and it just sort of blew up, and now we're in these sort of burning culture wars.
I wonder, if you look at some debates where there is an accepted norm, climate change is a perfect example of that, right? And you can look in the New Zealand academic system, and you can look at perhaps health advocacy, particularly out of the University of Otago, where contrarian views are discouraged. And they're discouraged overtly, either by shunning somebody who might be an academic. And I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Professor Mari Glover, and she has been effectively in New Zealand shut out of any debate on tobacco control, even though she has 31 years experience in studying tobacco control methods, is a recognized expert in dealing with addictive substances, those sorts of things. But you will never hear her on you won't hear her on Radio New Zealand. You won't see her on TVNZ, for example. And she's been shut out because she has a contrarian view that's not the official dogma of tobacco control, which is nicotine is evil and big tobacco are evil. Yeah. On all those things. Climate change is another. If you've got a contrarian view on that, you're now a lunatic. You get shunned. You're not, they come out with things like 1,500 climate scientists all agree on this, and therefore we must all agree on it. where that leads to as well is a silencing of those contrarian views because they no longer get funded in the funding round. Do you think that has a significant aspect in silencing contrarian views? I mean,
I definitely think so. Yeah, funding is a tricky one because we didn't actually get time to look into that specifically. We thought about trying to do a study just of funding and ideology and funding applications, and also ethics committees. These committees that sort of judge whether your experiment or your study can go ahead because of ethics concerns. And nowadays, which makes sense if they're dealing with like animals or something, but nowadays they often seem to have this element of it needs to respect the Treaty of Waitangi, even though it might not seem obvious to people designing these experiments or studies that their study actually has anything to do with the Treaty of Waitangi. So yeah, I think that these funding decisions and ethics boards do play a role. We didn't look at them specifically, but we had a lot of testimonies from academics, 72, as I said earlier. And in a lot of those testimonies, people say that, yeah, if you don't, well, again, there's probably a broad field of action where you can sort of make decisions about what you're going to study and you'll be fine. But if you go against the orthodoxy on these key issues, ethnicity and sexuality and sex and gender, those types of things, then, a lot of academics told us they think that their career is going to be harmed by that. They're not going to get the grant. They're not going to get the promotion, and they may even get in trouble of some sort.
Well, it's a bit of a chilling effect, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting you told me that story about, what was the name of the lady, Glover?
Mari Glover, Professor Mari.
So I'd be interested to hear more because this is the problem with this report is that we kept hearing more stories. And some of the times, like people would say, oh, I remember this thing happened. Why don't you ask this person? And we'd email that person and they'd say, sorry, no can do. We'd love to talk to you, but I signed a non-disclosure agreement. There's actually quite a lot of, again, like we haven't done an actual empirical study of how many non-disclosure agreements are out there, but we heard a lot of cases of people saying, we can't talk to you about this because I've signed a non-disclosure agreement. We even heard from one relatively senior professor who said that he basically had a non-disclosure agreement universally imposed on him by the university, who basically said, don't talk about this topic or we will get rid of you. So, I mean...
It's a serious infringement on academic freedom, isn't it?
Well, that's right. So that's just someone's claim. It hasn't been confirmed, but I mean, that's the kind of thing that we've been hearing. And my impression is that these non-disclosure agreements are actually quite widespread. And, people say, okay, they sign these all the time in the public service and in other private companies. Fine, but it's like, these are universities. They're meant to be places of free speech and free inquiry. Why do they feel the need to sign these agreements? I don't really understand that.
I mean, I'm struggling with it as well because I've always viewed university as being a place where you test ideas or hypothesis, or you have an experiment and you see if it can be replicated, and then someone will say, well, hang on, you've done that slightly wrong there. Maybe if you'd done it this way, we'd have a different result. It's all about testing and retesting until you can prove your point. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, to be fair, like some of these non-disclosure agreements, the university might be afraid of just sort of ordinary kind of sour grapes or something, but still you'd think that the right approach there would just be to sort of let the person have their say and then rebut their criticisms if they're able to.
The second threat you mentioned was the CCP. And I've long thought that the CCP was a threat, not just in academia, but in New Zealand society in general. And that's from my own personal observations. I mean, I was brought up in a highly political household. My father was the president of the National Party for a time. And I remember him when I was a kid getting phone calls from the consul general, the Chinese consul general, or the ambassador, asking him as the president of the party to go and tell ministers, MPs to pull their head in. And that was a overt political involvement by a foreign power and the diplomatic corps to influence New Zealand politics. Mm-hmm. We've seen also the CCP infiltrating political parties, most notably National and Labour, and them being people who are highly connected with the CCP, even though they'll say they're not. The reality is if someone comes out of China with millions of dollars, that's with the approval of the government and the CCP. And they've had donations and all of that have been traced back to CCP-connected companies, et cetera, in China. And that's evidence in court, right? So it's been tested. It's been found that that's where the money came from, and we've got that influence. And then you've got the famous cases like Professor Anne-Marie Brady, who is probably the most prominent researcher who has come under intense pressure from CCP operatives and people. That's a huge threat, not just from this, we've got woke ideology, that's a threat all by itself, but now you've got a pernicious bad actor playing with academic freedom.
No, I agree. I mean, we wrote up several episodes, several sort of academic freedom incidents on this. They cluster around 2018, 2020, as I said at the beginning. So it may be that universities in New Zealand have sort of caught on to this threat and have taken measures to sort of be safer or, put some security measures in place. Or it may be that the Chinese Communist Party is just more successfully kind of getting away with it and being more subtle. It's hard to tell. There was a big debate about Confucius Institutes. I think some of those still exist, though. I read a lot of reports from other think tanks abroad, like in Australia and the UK. There's one for the Civitas think tank by Robert Clark, where one of the things they do is they look at various ostensibly kind of academic programs that the Chinese have, China has, it runs with English-speaking countries and other countries. And it kind of, and these reports kind of bring evidence to bear that suggests that, yeah, some of these programs are legitimate and academic and they're pretty innocent, but some of them have these strange features. For example, some of them are linked to these kind of military-backed universities. So there's 7 universities in China called the Seven Sons of National Defense. And they are linked very closely with the People's Liberation Army. And so there are a few cases in other countries where there's been a kind of academic exchange, and the academic coming to the West has just happened to also be, in the People's Liberation Army. So they're actually part of the security state. Robert Clark's report for Civitas also went into the Chinese Scholarship Council scholarships, and he just looked at some of the language that they were using for scholarship applicants in China. So these are scholarships for Chinese students to come to the West. And if you read the small print or you read the Chinese characters, they actually say, we're selecting people who are, good communists effectively, and we want you to go spread communism abroad, or, whatever they say, Xi Jinping thought, or they use some other euphemism. But so I could go on in that vein, but there are several of these programs that people have raised suspicions about. And it seems like some of them are around in New Zealand. So, for example, Confucius Institutes are still around in New Zealand. It doesn't mean that everyone involved with the Confucius Institute is a spy. We need to shut them down immediately. That's not what we recommend in the report. What we recommend is just we need to be a lot more cautious about these things. Just take a step back and review them. And if we want to have intellectual and academic contacts with the Chinese, which obviously we do because they're the second biggest country in the world, we just have to make sure that we're doing ones which are, really have no suspicion of being part of the security apparatus. We don't have to have these exchanges with universities that are linked to the military. We could have exchanges with other universities. So I think there's some pretty kind of pragmatic and sort of commonsensical steps we could take to continue to engage with the Chinese, which we need to do, but also, just be sensible about our own security.
I mean, it's not the Chinese people, is it? It's the state apparatus, the CCP controlled organizations.
That's right.
Like these universities, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure that national candidate who ended up being an MP was a former PLA instructor at one of those universities.
Right, I think that's true, yeah. You're exactly right. It's not the Chinese people themselves. And in fact, a lot of Chinese people actually, want what you and I want. They want to be free. They want to be able to speak freely. And some of them come to the West precisely for that reason. So that's something that came out very strongly in that Stuff documentary, where they talked to a lot of Chinese, ethnic Chinese people in New Zealand who come from China precisely as dissidents. And that shows up in our academic freedom incidents as well. So one of them involves this student called Serena Lee, who was putting up pro-Hong Kong independence posters at University of Auckland. And I think they got torn down or they got covered over. And then there's actually a video of this, quite interesting. You see these 3 or 4 Chinese men turn up who start sort of berating her in Chinese and saying that, she shouldn't be doing this. And I think just sort of chanting nationalist slogans at her. And she ends up on the floor. I mean, one of them kind of pushes her. It's not like a huge push or like a punch to the face or anything, but she kind of ends up on the floor because of this. So, I mean, that person is obviously an example of someone who is Chinese, but who doesn't like the Communist Party. And there are a lot of people in that camp, and we should be trying to defend them and sort of, if they've come to the West partly to get away from that and because they value free speech and things, we should stand up for those values.
Yeah, I mean, it's widely reported around the world in other jurisdictions that there's a network of informers people have come here for whatever reason, but are sympathetic to the regime in China and actually dob in their fellow citizens.
Yeah, it's very tricky. I mean, one of the big problems is, if the Education Act defines academic freedom as the freedom of academics or students to basically state controversial opinions and say what they want. And that's, well, it should be easy enough, but it's at the moment it seems hard enough just for New Zealand students and academics. But there's also this problem in the case of the CCP that we get a lot of Chinese students coming from mainland China and then wanting to go back. And in Australia, at least, there was one incident that we know of where a student posted on Facebook pro-democracy messages from Australia. And that student, I think that student's family was then arrested in China. So that's a really tough situation that we can't really do much about in New Zealand, that, Chinese students coming here, tragically, they're wanting to kind of participate in democratic and liberal debate. They are at risk of being persecuted when they go back to China.
Or their family persecuted.
Or their family, that's right, yeah.
Which again, it becomes chilling. I mean, is part of this problem with dealing with the CCP threat in our universities for academic freedom part of the makeup of New Zealand, in that we're pretty relaxed about anybody coming here? We're pretty welcoming, especially in places like universities, to other people, other cultures.
Yeah.
And we don't have in the forefront of our mind that actually some of the people that are coming here are not coming here with good intentions.
It's a tough thing with China. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things going on. I think one of them is just this idea that, we don't want to be racist. We want to be welcoming to immigrants. But also with China, there was this movement, in the political class around like the time that David Cameron was prime minister in the UK. He really exemplifies this. So after around 2010, his whole strategy was we need to engage more with China because that will help China democratize. As China, rubs shoulders with people in the West, these values will get passed on. Also, they'll become richer. There was the idea that as the society became developed, that it would become freer. And frankly, that hasn't happened. And I think that in recent years, we've seen a kind of pull back from that as people have realized, yes, they're not exactly the Marxists of Mao anymore, and they're more liberal when it comes to economics. But they're still, not all of them, obviously. Most of them are just Chinese people, and some are actually, as I said, sort of dissidents. They want to come here for free speech. But you have to be aware that this country is run by a communist dictatorship, and that's very dangerous. So as I say, we want to engage with them, especially the kind of vast majority of students who are here just to study. But also we just want to take some sort of sensible steps to kind of review these programs that have links with the People's Liberation Army or the Chinese Communist Party directly. We're not sure we should be engaged with those programs in particular.
We've seen that here, though, in New Zealand too, that same sort of attitude as David Cameron, most notably with John Key. We're also seeing now Don Brash talking in pro-Chinese, manners, and Helen Clark as well.
Yeah, it was interesting. Don Brash and Helen Clark wrote a column, didn't they, for the Herald, I think, where they sort of argued in favor of more engagement with the Chinese. I mean, I think, as I say, they're right in the sense that, yes, we need to engage with the Chinese. They're hugely important. They're our biggest trading partner. They're the second biggest country in the world. On the academic front also, you have to say that in some ways, they've done a great job with their education system. They have really high achievement in math at school level. And so there's things that we can learn from them. But, it just makes sense to be a little bit careful. And if we're engaging with them in some program, that program should be entirely academic. It shouldn't be one where, the scholar we're going to send you just happens to be a major in the National Army of China.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I was looking back on my political history, and I was a big advocate for the same sort of things that David Cameron was talking about. If we trade with China, then they'll become wealthier. Then people, when they get wealthier, become aspirational, and that will, override that communist dictatorship type thing. And I've completely changed my mind on all of that after seeing the pervasive way that the CCP infiltrated political parties tried to dominate debate. And then, of course, we had the COVID stuff where the CCP was actively working hand in glove with the WHO and various other, organizations around the world to hush up. It's my feeling, I might be wrong on that, but hush up the origins of all of this. And you saw this, this almost somersaulting by Quango organizations like the WHO. We don't want to be racist. We don't want to call every other virus in the world's named after where it came from, right? But all of a sudden now we have this made up name. And we're seeing the same sort of pervading attitudes with this supposed monkeypox. We're not allowed to call it monkeypox. We have to call it mpox. And it's almost been driven by people who have very strong academic credentials that we don't want to offend anybody. And in the process of not offending anybody, we're glossing over what the actual situation may be.
Yeah. I mean, it may still be the case that if we engage with China more, or at least it may still be the case that as China gets richer, it'll get more free. The point is just that right now we should be under no illusions that it's still a communist autocracy. And, and it's also a communist, I think for New Zealand especially, it's a communist autocracy that is, several times our weight. I think maybe if you're the US or even the UK, you can take a slightly more blasé attitude towards China, even though, of course, in those countries, the Chinese security apparatus will be even more, interested in interfering and penetrating their own defenses. But with New Zealand, I think we're just very small, and it's clear that China is interested, not only in the South China Sea, but also in influencing the Pacific. And it's not that we're sort of so far away that they don't care. We're also, an English-speaking country, and we're in the Five Eyes security information exchange network. And so it's possible that China sees us as the sort of soft underbelly of the Anglophone alliance. So we just, as I say, I'll just reiterate it again, we need to be on our guard. However, it would be insane to sort of completely pull back, ban Chinese students, so ban research collaborations with the Chinese. That would be absolutely foolish. We don't want to do that. We just want to be a bit sensible and, take a hard look at these collaborative programs.
But you're right about their interest in the Pacific. It's not that we're a long way away. I mean, I was born in Fiji, and I have a close interest in what's going on in Fiji, and I'm watching China investing in their supplying funds for, the University of South Pacific, all of these sorts of things going on in Fiji. And people say to me, well, why would China care about Fiji? And I said, well, there's all these submarine networks all across the Pacific that are running the internet, and almost all of them pass through Fiji. At some point, they come up, go down in Fiji. So I can understand why they would want to infiltrate a country that doesn't have the same sort of rigor in politics or even in the state sector, to say, no, we don't want to have Huawei, things in our electronics or communications infrastructure, because we don't want to give China a backdoor entry into that network. But it's happening. And we're seeing that. And part of that also is in New Zealand, of course, a lot of the internet is controlled out of academia, out of universities, and an adjunct to that. So I can see there being a real push on that in order to control communications protocols.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I don't know exactly what their strategy is or what their tactics are, but I mean, if we think about the particular evidence that we've put in this report about the Chinese threat, I mean, one of them is Anne-Marie Brady, as you mentioned, who claims that her house was burgled by the Chinese. I think those are very plausible claims. People who've watched the Stuff documentary will know also there was the matter of a car with, I think, 2 Chinese dissidents in it that sort of disappeared. So, I mean, there's Anne-Marie Brady was talking about that in the documentary. And then there's Serena Lee cases that I talked about before, where it's more to do with sort of protests, and then it seems like these people sort of show up. It's not clear whether they're students or members of the public, whatever, mainland Chinese sort of people, characters sort of turn up and try and sort of berate the person for being pro Hong Kong. So, I mean, it's not as bad as in Australia. I think there was some sort of more full-on episodes. Actually, no, one thing I would like to get in, one episode I almost forgot, was AUT. So AUT, there was this lecturer, Ju Wan, I believe his name was, who booked a room in order to have an event commemorating the Tiananmen Square massacres. So this is obviously in 2019, which I guess would have been, the 40th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. And the Chinese embassy, or the Chinese consulate, actually wrote to Auckland University of Technology, basically wrote to the top brass, the vice chancellor and other senior administrators, and said, basically, we don't like this. Can we meet about this? And they actually met with them. All the emails, they're available because someone put in an Official Information Act request. And we've excerpted a lot of them in our write-up of the episode. But it really is kind of astounding to read that. I mean, to be fair, the Vice Chancellor of AUT does say something like, you have to appreciate, he says this to the Chinese Vice Consul General, you have to appreciate we have a strong tradition of free speech in this country. So he has that in his email, but he also says something like, it's very convenient that you've written to us because actually it just so happens that this lecturer booked this room on a day when the university was officially closed. I think it was a public holiday. And so he's basically saying, we're really happy that, we can kind of do this. We can cancel this event. Whereas what he probably should have done is reach out to the lecturer. Well, first of all, say clearly to the Chinese embassy to butt out. It's not their business. But then maybe reach out to the lecturer who booked the room. If it really was a problem that it was booked on a public holiday, say to him, you can hold it on this day or that day. But instead, they seem to have canceled the event. Not only that, but they sent, I think it's described in the emails as a light security presence to the event, just in case anybody turned up, in order to kind of shoo them away and say that the event was canceled. So that kind of thing, I mean, I just think it's incredible to me that the higher ups didn't think that they might, get in trouble if this came out. They didn't even seem to sort of cross their minds that this is an inappropriate way of dealing with the Chinese embassy, But I mean, I think it reflects what you said at the beginning. There's a lot of dependency on China. Something like 11% of university revenues in New Zealand come from international students, and the biggest single group of international students, I think it's something like 30%, about a third is from China. And there's all these research collaborations as well. Actually, Australia has more of those, but New Zealand does have a few as well, and they can be highly lucrative. So, yeah, I just think universities sort of need to be clear that they're actually legally mandated to protect free speech. So that should actually come above this concern for Chinese money.
Does that link to your third point or third threat, managerial neoliberal threat, and
Yes.
the activity of the managers? There's funding at risk here, potentially from international students or actual money that's coming out of China, and they're acting to protect that. And are they a business, or is this something that should be concerning? I mean, I'm not a big fan of the state funding everything.
Yeah. Well, this is the funny thing. I mean, we wrote the chapter on neoliberalism, and people in the initiative are generally pretty pro free enterprise, and I'm in favor of free enterprise as well. But it's an open question whether the precise way that we marketize the universities and open them to competition in the Rogernomics period, whether that was, whether we got all aspects of that right. I think that it's good to have competition. There's lots of evidence from other spheres of life that competition can drive up standards, but in some ways, seeing students as customers isn't quite the right way of seeing them, because it leads to the situation where the administrators and some of the academics kind of bend over backwards to please the students. And they're quite easy to scare, it seems like, in a lot of these incidents. Sometimes it's just sort of one student who will complain about something, and then immediately the administrators will put out a statement of some sort. I think one of the episodes that involved that was Raymond Richards, who was this lecturer at Waikato, and he had a Facebook post about Islam. He said something like, can you trust an employee who prays 5 times a day? So it's like, it's an opinion. I don't know if I share it, but that was his opinion. And immediately, I think Waikato, the communications director, put out this statement. And I think in those situations, the administrators are thinking, oh no, we're going to get a really bad reputation. But I actually think that most New Zealanders know that universities are supposed to be places of free speech. I actually think that they're probably doing more harm to the university's reputation by clamping down on sort of opinions like that than they would just by sort of letting people speak freely.
Well, we saw that with Don Brash, didn't we, with an event that was organised at Massey and all of a sudden turned into an absolute debacle where he wasn't able to speak. And they shut him down. They used spurious term. They said it was a health and safety issue.
Oh, yeah, that brings us on to a whole other subject, which is safetyism. But no, I mean, before we get there, that was probably the most spectacular example of this tendency of over-powerful managers to sort of shut things down. I mean, the thing about managerialism is that we sort of initially thought it was going to be another kind of cause of the free speech crisis, the academic freedom crisis, alongside the CCP and progressive radicalism. But actually, it's kind of different in its nature. It's sort of like the lever or the node through which these threats go. Because the progressive radicalism in the Chinese Communist Party wouldn't be that much of a problem if the administrators could just be trusted to protect free speech, right? If when the Chinese embassy wrote to AUT, they just responded curtly but politely, basically, this is none of your business, that would have stopped it in its tracks. And it's the same thing with a lot of these progressive radicals. Like the student radicals will say, basically, this academic needs to be in trouble. And if the administrators could be trusted just to be like, you're just one student, we have a duty to protect free speech, plug off, or something more polite. But what we see in the case of the Don Brash deplatforming is not only administrators, very senior administrators who aren't standing up for free speech when they come under pressure. It's actually the highest administrator, the highest sort of manager of the university, the vice chancellor herself, Jan Thomas. She's the one who starts the cancellation. Like she finds out, I think someone writes to her about this event, which is actually a politics society, a student politics society who have invited Don Brash to give a talk about his career in politics. And you see again in the emails, they're available online because somebody put in an Official Information Act request. She immediately writes to her other higher ups and starts saying things like, what are the options for shutting this down? He is very racist. So it's clearly her political opinions. And she even actually, I think she asked this twice when people didn't answer initially. She asks about defunding student groups. So immediately her thought is, I don't like the student group inviting Don Brash. I'm going to shut down the student group, which is obviously against what the Education Act says about how both academics and students have a right to explore ideas. So, I really don't like the tendency nowadays of people trying to get others canceled and fired. However, I will say, if you're the vice chancellor of a university and you're bound by the Education Act to protect freedom of speech, and you not only fail to do that, but you are the main threat yourself, I find it very difficult to understand how she kept her job. But hopefully she's learned from that episode.
I'm not one for cancellation. If there's someone who is coming to New Zealand to speak or is speaking at a university and I don't agree with them, well, I just don't go.
Well, yeah, there's lots of options. If you don't like it, if you really think it's terrible and you won't be able to live through it, just don't go to the talk. If you disagree with it, another option is you can go to the talk, you stick your hand up at the end, and you say, Mr. Lomborg, I don't agree with what you said about climate change because I have the following considerations. I read a book about it and I said that. What do you think of that? You can go to it and record it or take notes, and you can write a letter to the newspaper the next day. Nowadays, of course, there are any number of options. You can go on Twitter. You can literally sit in the talk and say, Lomborg is saying this is false. Look at this graph, right? So I don't understand why we have to shut these talks down at all. And part of that is the safeties. Maybe it's good time to get to that, because a lot of these episodes, they involve, the reason that these things are shut down ultimately is because people bring in these claims of safety. And that's also one that was involved in the Massey case with Don Brash, that people started saying.
I was going to raise that.
Yeah,
I was going to raise that. Like in 1944, 18-year-olds were charging off landing craft into machine gun nests and artillery and everything else, with the D-Day landings. Now 18-year-olds seem to have safe spaces and they've got all these people wanting to protect them, and they're wrapped in cotton wool and there's a layer of bubble wrap around that and then a helmet on as well. Are we weakening society by trying to protect young people from dangerous ideas or just ideas?
Yes. We're not only weakening society. We're weakening society specifically in the sense that liberal democratic society, like the society we actually value and that those people in World War II were protecting, it's very difficult for that to function if people aren't able to exchange ideas. And they're not going to be able to exchange ideas if every time somebody hears something that offends them, they try and shut an event down. This is also something that we kept having incidents that occurred while we were trying to finish out the report and we couldn't get them in. But one of them was the postponement of Nick Smith's free speech event at Vic. And there was a student representative who went on to the platform with Sean Plunkett. And one of the things she said was it was a dangerous situation because if it had taken place in the hub, there may have been students passing by who heard things that those people were saying, those people being my colleague Michael Johnston and Jonathan Ailing of the Free Speech Union, who are, if that's your idea of a kind of alt-right provocateur who's going to damage you by their speech, then you've got another thing coming. But so this kind of language is actually pervasive. You read through our academic freedom incidents, again and again, people appeal to that. And sometimes, there's one episode with flyers at the University of Auckland, I actually looked at the evidence and some of the posters, and people said they were white supremacist groups. I do think maybe those groups were white supremacists, but immediately everyone said, we have to take down all the posters because the students are going to be unsafe. But it's like, was there actually any evidence that the students were going to be literally unsafe? I still don't think so. I think it's good to train students to be able to cope with ideas that they don't like, and the idea that other people are discussing ideas that they don't like. The final thing I'll say on this is that it's not only weakening society, it's weakening the students themselves, and it's making them less happy. I mean, that's the argument of Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And the point of that is just that there's all sorts of evidence from psychology that exposure, controlled exposure in an actually safe environment, but safe in the old sense of like you're not literally being beaten up or something, that actually helps you become stronger. So if students are saying, I cannot deal with somebody with different political views speaking in front of me, the answer to that is not to force them into the room, but to encourage them. Why don't you try? Like, what if you go to this talk and you sit down? If you feel really terrible, you can leave the room, but just try and see if you can bear it. And so there is some evidence for a kind of student mental health crisis. Some people think they've just sort of broadened the terms depression and anxiety too much, but I think there's probably a real effect as well. And I think that this is probably worsening it, that you're telling students you can't cope with ideas, when the reality is they probably can cope with people disagreeing with them, and they can cope with actually answering back and asking questions and things like that too.
Isn't that the key finding? I mean, I guess if you look at all of these threats, progressive threat, wokeism, safetyism, managerialism, the CCP, we're closing down and homogenizing thought or speech in our universities, which is where everybody goes to get degrees to end up working in the civil service or the professional classes or lawyers, accountants, all of that. And they're not being exposed to any opinions there's this orthodoxy of what's accepted and what's not. We're setting our society up for failure, ultimately, when we're cosseting and to use that term, coddling the minds of young people in how we teach them, and then they're going to go out into the world and experience real life, and it's going to smack them in the face real hard. And then they say, well, we're not used to this. We don't like what we're hearing. I'm being told to come to work at 8:00 on Monday, this sort of thing. And then they build this inside the organizations they're working for, government organizations, private companies, and we spread this wokeism in fiction and all these other things into society in general, and end up with a weaker society as a result, because nobody's been challenged about anything.
Yeah, no, I think it's very dangerous. I mean, I think it's also bad for academic research. I mean, there was an organization started in the States a few years ago, Heterodox Academy, that you might have heard of.
Yep.
And the whole point of that was also started by Jonathan Haidt, incidentally. And the whole point of that was basically, if you're doing research on a particular topic, let's say sex and gender, and everybody who's working on that comes from a kind of cultural point of view, a left postmodern cultural point of view, you're going to produce worse research, because there are all these points that people who are, say, evolutionary psychologists or take a more kind of binary view of sex could challenge, you could sort of put when you presented your work, that would actually improve it. Even if you don't agree with that view, right? The fact that you have to deal with objections is going to strengthen your own work. I mean, I do think, I will say again, that there's plenty of good work being done in the university. There's plenty of good teaching and research being done. The average sort of chemistry seminar isn't crazy woke. Maybe it's a little bit woke around the edges, but there are a lot of people who are doing good work, and they can explore ideas within certain parameters. But the problem is there are these particular topics where it's very, very difficult to talk about anything. And those are the ones where we risk getting things really quite wrong, I think. So, ethnicity and race and sex and gender. And not only is there a risk of getting things wrong, but I just think in and of itself, like if you take the view that actually there are just two sexes and you want to state that in a university class, you should be able to, just because you were living in a free country, right? It's sort of outrageous to me that, or if you're a politics group, you want to have Don Brash come and give a talk. It's just bizarre to me that we're going to let this be shut down by some kind of more powerful person in the university. I think people have a right to discuss things.
Which then leads to, I guess, probably, summing up, I guess, is what sort of guardrails should be put in place so that we can prevent this ideological capture, whether it's the Communist Party of China or radical, leftist feminists or whatever, effectively capturing the minds of our best students or workers because they've got biased professors.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of problems at the university, and we can't deal with them all in one sort of blow and one reform program or individual reform. So I actually think that with the universities, so with these sort of deplatformings and cancellations and the academic freedom issue, we actually need new legislation. So I think we need something along the lines of the UK's Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which unfortunately it looks like the Labour government might try to repeal. But it was put through. It did receive royal assent by the previous Conservative government. And what that does is that it sets up a free speech czar at the government level in the Office for Students, which is the UK's university regulator. And it also introduces a new tort. So that's a civil wrong that would allow students and academics whose free speech rights have been violated to effectively take their persecutors, I guess, to court. You know, so if you have your talk shut down, there's a complaints process, which is non-legal, but there's also a legal process, which in extreme cases you can use. And I think that would help a lot, even if people didn't use it, because it would put that question into the chancellor's mind, like, are we actually going to get taken to court for this? So I think we need something like that. The Free Speech Union is actually going to do their own report, and that's going to come out in November. And they've looked at all these legislative options, and they're going to recommend something. So I won't steal their thunder too much. In our report, we actually have a few recommendations of our own, which we think will also help. So one thing is that we think there should be an audit of free speech or academic freedom at every New Zealand university every year, probably led by the government, because I'm not sure we can trust the universities to do it well themselves. And that would include a survey of academics and students, and it would include a list of any free speech or academic freedom incidents that have occurred during that year. Well, I've said this before, we think that universities should continue to collaborate with China, but we should also review any kind of CCP-linked programs. We think that university administrators should receive more training about academic freedom, what it is, and what their obligations are to it in the Education Act. And finally, I mean, maybe as part of that training, we should move away from emphasizing safety. At least safety should go back to what it used to mean, which is that, you know, you're safe from like a fire burning everybody, you know, killing everybody. You're safe from, you know, thieves coming in from the street or something, but you're not safe from ideas. Exposing yourself to ideas and words is actually the point of the university. It's like, I think an American commentator used the analogy of you going into the gym and saying, these weights are too heavy, let's get rid of all these dumb weights. The weights are the point, right? It's the same thing with ideas at the university. You're there to expose yourself to ideas which are going to challenge you.
And in exposing yourself to those ideas, you form thoughts that give you a toolkit to counter those ideas in another scenario.
Well, that's right. I mean, ideally, people will be exposed to, these are young people, they're going to be exposed to ideas across the political spectrum. Maybe if they come in more conservative, they'll be exposed to more liberal ideas. Well, definitely that's going to happen nowadays. And this is actually a good thing in itself, I think. But hopefully we'll get back to a situation someday where if you come in very left-wing, you'll also be exposed to right-wing ideas. And the point isn't to kind of convert people to the other side. It's just to make sure that they, you know, get a full sense of how the world is and what opinions other people have.
And it's kind of like what we do here at Reality Check Radio, right? We expose our listeners to differing ideas, political, or in my case, it's political, you know, those sorts of things, because it's a political show, but expose people to those different ideas and concepts and actually try and get the people that we're talking to have a good say so that they can impart that information. I mean, it's protected in our Bill of Rights, right? With the right to receive information, not just the right to speak, it's the right to receive as well.
That's right. There are also listeners' rights, right? Like if you're a student group and you want to hear Don Brash speak, I think you should have, in fact, you do, as you point out, you do have the right to do that.
Yeah, I mean, a good example would be Candace Owen, who's coming to New Zealand, I think, in November. Now, I think she's a terrible anti-Semite, and I have no truck with many of her views. Should she be blocked from coming to New Zealand? Absolutely not. Let's get her in here and let her say her piece. And if I feel exercised enough, I may go along and ask some questions and challenge, but I probably won't, right? But it doesn't affect me, her coming here. I'm not going to get upset about it. I'm not going to, you know, threaten to cut my wrists because someone with 30 ideas is coming to New Zealand. And I think we need to be brave and grown up and tell these people who are trying to silence academics or research or anything, grow up.
Yeah, I mean, that's at least the classic liberal democratic idea. And I think we've sort of lost our self-confidence weirdly in this, because it's, I saw Candace Owens trending on Twitter the other day, or X or whatever, and I did look at a video and she was kind of ranting, and it made it, like, sometimes at least I understand what people are saying, but it made like no sense to me. So I just don't see why people are scared of that, because it just seems so dumb, right? Like, I'm not afraid that people are going to all start agreeing with that, because I just think most people will probably, and I obviously am able to look at something like that without it immediately infecting me and becoming an anti-Semite, right? And I think a lot of New Zealanders would probably just look at that and think, this is dumb.
she's done and you're crazy and thanks very much. I'll move on to whatever else is in my feed.
And this is one of the old arguments for free speech. It's actually good to give stupid people, but people with dumb ideas, freedom of speech as well, because it gives people information about what they really think and what they're saying. And then if you don't like it, then you can be like, okay, I don't need to read anything about Candace Owens in the future.
There you go. I'm convinced you are dumb. It's kind of like that speech that Tucker Carlson did in Australia, where he was being asked stupid questions by a journalist, and he turned around and he said, I've just met you and you're being rude, and but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. I might have thought you were stupid, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And then it went on and on and on, and he says, you know what? I've changed my mind now. I'm not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You are stupid, but that all happened because he was willing to be questioned and let the questioner ask the questions to prove to everybody that these were stupid questions.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I guess maybe I'm too high-minded, but I would prefer him to actually kind of, after we listened to it all, to sort of cut down all the arguments on a purely kind of evidence-based. But yeah, I mean, at least he let her speak. I think that was a good thing. Yeah.
Well, it's a fascinating report, and it's a lot to take in, and I've only just sort of scratched the surface here. But I've welcomed your input on this as the author of the report, and I think those recommendations that you suggested and the threats that we have are real, and we need to be looking at those potential solutions. And together with the Free Speech Union, whenever they come out with theirs, I'll hopefully talk to them as well about those solutions. And between the two reports, we try and get somebody in the government to realise that there actually is a problem here in New Zealand universities, but it's not an insurmountable problem, that it can just be fixed with some simple things.
Yeah, and that's really our attitude as well. It's not like universities immediately have to be blown up or, shut down completely. It's more like there's a problem here. There's also a lot of good stuff going on at universities. We want to reform them in a sensible way.
But it's an easy thing to do.
If there's political will, I think the recommendations that we've made and that maybe the Free Speech Union will make, I think they're definitely, they're realistic. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
I don't know about you, but those three key areas, the progressive left and its impact on censorship, the malign influence of the CCP in silencing debate and opinions, and the managerialism and safetyism of senior management in universities who are seeking to protect the brand, are very concerning, and we should be very vigilant that we can try and nip all of this nonsense in the bud. What do you think? Email inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Professor Grant Schofield is a public health researcher with an interest in nutrition. He wrote the foreword of Dr. Kierstead's report. Let's see what he has to say about the challenges to academic freedom in New Zealand universities. Joining me now is Professor Grant Schofield. Welcome to The Crunch.
Thanks, Cam. Good to see you.
Well, it's good to be here. And I was reading the foreword that you wrote for the New Zealand Initiative report about unpopular opinions and academic freedom. And there's a couple of things in there that kind of rattled my cage a bit. And I thought, I need to talk to you. Now, why don't you tell us what you wrote in the foreword, and then I've got a couple of questions for you that we can run through, because some things interested me about your journey.
Yeah, so the James Kierstead's work in the New Zealand Initiative in that report, first of all, I just want to commend him. I think it's a really good synthesis. So I wrote a foreword a while back when the Free Speech Union put out their survey results and looked at how people felt about free speech in New Zealand universities, and then included my university, AUT, which actually did the worst. And then I, summarily received a barrage of mostly faceless but abusive emails from random academics around the country that I should just shut up, and all from the progressive left who didn't quite get what I was saying. And then they were criticising the quality of the research. I suppose one good thing about this report from James is it goes to another level, right? Because it's not just that research that he quotes, but there's research from all around the world. There's more data out of New Zealand, and then there's excruciating detail on the misjustices, I suppose, but particularly things like the Listener 5, the behaviour of the University of Auckland, and these sorts of things. So, first of all, it's a good read. Second, the reason I want to support it is we have moved. The problem of the progressive left in making topics off limits because someone, not me, but someone I know might be offended, is fundamentally stupid. We have legal frameworks around where your behaviour can start and stop, and we've decided as a society what those are. And if they're not fit for purpose, then we'll relitigate those in the courts and by governments, but not by someone's random on the left's opinion. And then the other one is just this managerial overreach, which is, you're going to interfere with the brand of the university. Again, it's a really odd employment situation where you can criticise your employer by law and criticise society and its approaches in terms of policy, and that by law. This is the Education Act and the academic freedom Act. So you want to take that seriously, and it also it works both ways. So there'll be a lot of opinions that I completely disagree with, but people should be free to say them. And so I wanted to support that. And I suppose, lastly, I look at my own journey. The thing that's brought out the very best in me as a scientist, as a public health advocate, and in the work we've done in nutrition, was fully having to front open debate where egos were bruised, and it was on. These guys are coming at you, and you came back, and I appreciate that stuff. It's if you don't like doing that, then you shouldn't. Just like if you don't like running long distances, you shouldn't be a marathon runner. Then you shouldn't be an academic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because universities have debating competitions where there's a for and against a particular statement or hypothesis, and they go hammer and tongs in as a sport, almost about it. But yet when it comes to actually serious stuff like research, there's almost like an approved, but you don't know what those approvals are until you say something that's contrary, and then you find out what those approvals are. That you can have a debate. And, it's interesting in your forward, you talk about this, I guess, the academic acceptance that is mostly from my research, it seems to be a post-World War II emergence of this idea that a low-fat, high-carb diet is the way to lose weight. But the evidence before us in society is that we've got people that are doing this, and yet they're fat bastards, really.
Well, it's a classic case of...
be a fat bastard, right? And so I went through this journey too, finding out what works for me. And what works for me was a medium fat diet and high protein and almost no carbs. And I actually didn't have to do any exercise, and the weight just came off me anyway. And I was sitting there thinking, this is wrong. And when you speak up about it, then you get your Professor Boyd Swinburnes and people like that who go, well, I'm a professor of nutrition and I know what I'm talking about, and you need to shut up. Well, telling me to shut up never works.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a fascinating topic, Cam, that virtually the people put in charge of protecting your health, and one of the main determinants in public health is what you eat, not only didn't quite get it right, they got it. There's only 3 macronutrients to choose from: carbs, fat, and protein. And they said you've got to minimize the fat and, eat as many carbs as you want at every meal, 5 to 7 servings of healthy whole grains, whatever the hell they are. So not only it was not right, it was exactly wrong. And it's the very thing that causes heart disease, stroke, dementia, all of the diabetes, all of the chronic diseases. And sure enough, if you do exactly what you said, big fan of higher protein, get the carbs out, and you'll be right.
Well, once you train your body to get away from raiding the carbs to get instant energy, and the most prolific carbohydrate that people have put into their body is actually sugar. Once you train your body to live without sugar, then it uses fat, which is how the body stores fat. I'm not a scientist, but it makes logical sense to me. If you eat a high carb diet, you end up fat, because it's the body going, woohoo, look at all this extra energy that I've got. I'll store that. Thank you very much. And it also gets easy to access carbohydrate, but you're not allowed to say this sort of stuff. Oh, no, that's contrary.
But you should. And so, that's the important thing. We should take a step back, though, Cam, because there's some fundamental changes here, right? So, so first of all, it's always been hard to change scientists' minds because, and this was the thing that a famous psychologist, Leon Festinger, in the 50s came up with the idea of cognitive dissonance. Once you've made up your mind, it's pretty hard to shift it. And his famous book is, and you'll love the title, Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Us. And it's a classic. You can reflect on COVID, the food pyramid, whatever. So that's always been an issue in science, and that's why this free and open debate is so important because, academics, believe it or not, and I know most people won't believe this, but believe it or not, academics historically have actually had a role in society that was useful. We did invent science. A lot of the things around modern medicine we did well. There's some absolutely fabulous procedures and things that have been developed over the years, all through academic science. It's just that in the last 10 years, and specifically, I think Jonathan Haidt wrote a great book in 2018, which was pretty pathetic, but it's come through in the world called The Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book, isn't it?
Brilliant book. And then that was just accelerated by the totalitarianism of COVID. And so whatever Haidt was seeing in 2018 just went rampant around the world, around a sort of that progressive left. Can't say anything less because I could be offended. There's no room for hurting people's feelings here. And then the sort of growth of the managerial layer and the universities and the need for brand and, all that type of thing, has just become such an entrenched part of the way that we think in academia that, we've now made ourselves, in many cases, redundant, and we don't actually have a role in society. And so, when people like you sometimes call people troffers, you did right, because that's actually a thing. And we've lost our way, and we need to refine our way. And that's why, James's works has some importance here.
Yeah, I mean, COVID was a big wake-up call. It was certainly a big wake-up call for me. I've always been a free speech advocate, but I just sort of I said, okay, we have free speech and took it for granted until it was taken away. And we saw it being taken away quite vociferously and quite viciously in many instances under COVID, where you saw, people like Asim Maltra, you saw, Robert Malone deliberately defamed, written out of the history of mRNA. Him saying, this is not what you use this for. I invented this. I was involved in this. I'm on the patents for this. Listen to me. This is not what you use it for. And they wrote him out of history, basically. And then you saw, of course, the famous case, the head of public health in Sweden saying, no, we're not going to do this. And everyone turned on him, the media especially. And all of a sudden you realized, if you actually don't fight, literally fight for your freedoms, and freedom of speech is a right, and we have a Bill of Rights Act that says that we've got that, well, the government just overrode all of that. And then we saw this developing throughout the university as well, where you had all of these academics that were put up in the media to discuss things. And if you dared speak against them, well, you were an awful person. And so whilst they had academic freedom, there was also a constraint on the public saying we can't criticize these academics, even though they're sitting there with their academic freedom. And so I've always viewed academic freedom as the canary in the coal mine of free speech. And if academics aren't free to speak about something or have a contrary opinion, well, then we're living in a society that has controls and censorship, and I'm not sure we want that.
Yeah, and to be fair, Simon Thornley and his group, and I was initially part of that Plan B group, and then sort of got pushed a bit out of it, I think mainly not from those guys, but, it just became untenable work-wise, that there were some people making some effort, but then they ended up really on the bad end of the stick. So it's one of the more shameful parts of our history, frankly. And you did write about the Bill of Rights, but there's also, one thing that I don't think people know is that there's the Health Act, which deals directly with the powers that the Director General has, which are extensive. But the important thing about them is that they're politically free. And so Bloomfield did make decisions, which were, and the most important one was recommending that we don't do mandates. and then that went to cabinet and they overrode it. So that Labor cabinet broke the law knowingly there with the powers of the Director General of Health. And when governments start to deliberately and deceitfully break the law, you've actually got a bit of a problem in society. And I don't know if that was evil or just incompetence or a combination of both. I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, but there was a chilling effect, and you're right. In the last 10 years, it's got really insane, and there's separate arguments that are off to the side, but are also included in the academic freedom argument. So, if you decided that, based on your experience, that there were two genders, male and female, well, you'd be rounded on for daring to say otherwise, because there's this acknowledgement, that tacit acknowledgement or overt acknowledgement, no, we can make up whatever genders we want. And every man in the street says, well, that's bullshit. But if you say it as an academic, then you get turned on, kind of like what J.K. Rowling has had, and anybody else who's into that debate.
But Cam, I think it's even more nuanced than that, and this is an important thing, right? So even within that, you're going, okay, so now we're giving basically kids below voting age would normally not be able to consent to anything. If you went through a university ethics committee, they wouldn't be able to give informed consent, and now able to give consent for medical procedures where there's plausible benefits, but there's also plausible harms. Some of those harms are quite serious. Just to even say that, it's like, there's medical procedures here, guys. We should have our eyes wide open and be openly discussing as a society any possible benefits and any possible harms. Just say you went in with that non-partisan subtlety, you'd be rounded on, right? So, which is a ridiculous thing, right? Because that's a completely scientific discussion.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the point, isn't it? A 9-year-old can't consent to having sex with an adult. Yeah. Right? That's the law. You can't do that. But they decide they want to be something else. Well, we'll go and spend tens of thousands of dollars and give you a whole lot of crazy drugs to do all of that because, it's self-awareness. It's nuts, really. And to be rounded on for that it's kind of like the climate argument too. I mean, how often do we hear the science is settled on climate change?
Yeah, well, I think on our nutrition discussion, the moment you hear the word most scientists think or the science is settled, that's generally a fair indication that you should look into it a bit more.
Well, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I understand the scientific method. Yeah. Right. And so if the science is settled, and it's very rare that the science is settled on particularly new things, then there's something wrong. It's either absolutely settled, we all agree on this, or there's more that needs to be looked into.
No, but it's never settled. That's the whole point of science. By definition, it's not settled. It's not a settled thing. And a classic thing are Newton's laws of physics. We all generally agreed they seem to work, but actually there's an approximation for something much more complicated that's going on. So it was, and they're actually wrong under many conditions. So the science is never settled.
Science used to be that we lived on a flat Earth. Right. So
are you kidding? Is that changed?
Settled, we'd still be thinking, mind you, there are some people who still think we live on a flat Earth. That it's a disk floating in space. But the important thing here is that if we've got a form of censorship or a censorious behavior through whatever means, it could be the progressive left, it could be managerialism, a safetyism, all of those things. That's what James was saying. All of these things have all combined to create a censorious nature in our academia that then is, and I'll use the word infecting society, because those people who believe those things and are censorious are teaching young people who then go on, once they've got their qualifications, to work in the civil service or in general society, and taking those views that they've been effectively brainwashed into them with them, and we end up with a debilitative society that hasn't learned to critically think or argue the point on anything.
Well, to take that a step further, one of the things you'd argue about aspects of poor mental health, particularly in young people, is that either more bad stuff's happening to them, or less bad stuff's happening to them, but they're not robust in a way to deal with life as it happens in an up and down way. And I think there's a reasonable argument in that sort of 16 to 25 age group that the tripling of mild to moderate mental health problems are probably more to do with a lack of robustness in the last decade than anything else. And this is why these aspects are so important. Don't think about that. You might find it difficult. These are you're having negative thoughts and feelings. Oh well, here's a way to not think about that. Or take that thing away, which is fundamentally a stupid approach on first principles to dealing with life as it exists in the actual world.
Yeah, I mean, I sit there and think, are we bringing up a nation of sissies? Because if you look at the past, I mean, I'm someone who calls things how I say them, and I use plain language, and people get offended by that, but that's their problem. That's a them problem, not a me problem.
Yeah.
But, in 1944, we had 18-year-olds charging off landing craft into machine gun nests and doing incredibly brave things in the defense of freedom and democracy. And 18-year-olds now need safe spaces. They can't work out whether they're Arthur or Martha, and they need to be, coddled, mollycoddled. And, no, we can't say that because Sebastian or Tarquin might get upset and get hurty feelings. Well, my mother used to say to me when somebody said something mean, and I said to her, oh, someone said something mean to me at school, she said, well, so what? Sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And I wonder why that's all disappeared, and why has it disappeared in academia when the whole scientific method is based around actually arguing?
Yeah, well, I mean, the other plausible reason for that, of course, is that there's a whole lot of academics that don't engage in the scientific method at all. And the most high-profile example of that recently is this Ray Gun, the breakdancer from the Aussie Olympics. And take away the fact that it's an abomination, the sport's ridiculous, and the good fun part that it was an Aussie and we can mock them more now than ever. The reality is she's a hard left feminist pedagogy academic. When you see what they mean when they say we do research into this, there's no human. And this is why people round on the Health Research Council, MB, and the Marsden Fund, and these sorts of things, because some of these things are funded, and people just look at them and go, "Well, it doesn't make any sense from first principles." That said, they also fund a bunch of good science, so it's not 100% bad, but that's just a classic example at the moment of they don't want to engage in science because they're not scientists. They don't do science. They don't understand the process. They have not only do they not understand it, they round on it as though it's it's a Western positivist male hegemony. I don't know all the words exactly, but what I'm talking about.
We don't know the buzzwords because we don't use them. So, but doesn't that raise an interesting point though, that could funding, or where the funding comes from, and this is what's hugely ironic for me, who enters into debates on the benefits of nicotine, for example. I mean, it's actually been a savior to me, nicotine, in helping me recover from a severe stroke that I had nearly 6 years ago.
Yeah.
But you talk about that to a medical professional or anybody else, and they just think you're nuts. But they haven't read what I've read, which are peer-reviewed medical studies that say nicotine is beneficial for increasing neuroplasticity and those sorts of things. But you can't have those arguments because someone gets all po-faced about it, and then you find out, well, actually they're being funded by XYZ company, and their corporate policy is that they're against this sort of thing. And now you've got the funding happening to the research in the university, and all of a sudden you have to be quiet because it might affect the funding.
It's interesting, that nicotine stuff. I'm deep down that rabbit hole at the moment, actually, Cam. And because I think, quite often now the science isn't getting done in the universities, it's getting done in the podcaster sphere with people, lay people that are just curious, and the sort of microdosing of nicotine, its effect in the brain, as you say, around neuroplasticity. There's a new hypothesis about a specific light-sensitive component, often in brain cells, called melanin. It's also in your skin, that losing that's a problem. Nicotine helps with that. There's a whole bunch of, it's just cutting edge, that stuff. It's awesome.
There's all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But we've all been told for the last 30 years nicotine's evil.
Well, it is in the sense that it comes in tobacco, and it's addictive drug and you put it in the smokes and you start chucking down, a packet a day. Obviously, that's going to end badly, but that's not what we're talking about, right?
No. I mean, if you use nicotine pouches or vaping, which is far less dangerous. It's dangerous still, it's got harms, but they're a lot less than smoking, burning things and inhaling all of the extra chemicals that tobacco companies add to the tobacco to make it burn faster. I mean, if you light a cigarette and sit it on an ashtray, it'll burn right to the end without any inhaling or anything. If you do that with a cigar, it'll go out, right? Because the cigar is just tobacco. There's nothing else in it. And tobacco doesn't burn that particularly well. But it's all to blame. Everything's blamed on nicotine, but nicotine's actually not harmful. In fact, it's in tomatoes and many other plants from the nightshade family have full of nicotinoids, and there are benefits. But you're not allowed to say anything about it because then you're in the pay of big tobacco, and they slur and smear and defame you for daring to have a different opinion. And
I didn't realise you were quite so well read in the medicine part. That's cool.
Well, when you're lying in hospital and you've just about died, and you've decided you want to live, someone like me, I just get straight into the right. How do I fix this? Whereas I was getting medical professionals come up to me, neurosurgeon with 30 years experience, saying, "Well, then you better get used to being a cripple for the rest of your life, Cam." And I said, "Well, stuff that. I don't like that. Doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. I'm going to fix this." Well, in my experience, Cam, you're not going to fix this. Well, I have. So why don't we look at Cam the miracle and find out what he did, and let's try and get other people to do the same thing, and maybe we won't have poor outcomes for people in their late 40s or early 50s having a stroke and spending a lifetime on welfare and poor outcomes.
A lot of inertia to overcome there, and big pharma, big food, and that whole sort of medical complex. I suppose the most encouraging thing to happen in the last little while is this RFK Jr.'s speech in the last week or so, which has sort of said, look, if he joins in with Trump, he's going to take charge of the health system. And he's the first person that started to talk about the corruption in the FDA and USDA and these types of NIH.
Corruption. I mean, if we take COVID as an example, and people go, "Oh, you're harping on a bit," but let's have a look at it. What many people don't realise is that in the initial stages of COVID, Cabinet met and they decided at some point that it would be a good idea when we do the lockdowns that we also don't allow people to buy alcohol, and we don't allow people to buy tobacco products or any of those sorts of products. That's what Ardern and some of our ministers wanted to do, with no understanding of addictions, no understanding of anything like that, and effectively trying to cold turkey people. And that was a deliberate decision that was made at Cabinet, and it was opposed and successfully opposed. But I can't imagine the carnage that would have caused if they had done that. But when you look at it and you think, why was that? And you look a bit deeper, and then you realise that you look at all the things that they all of a sudden were banned around the world. You had hydroxychloroquine, defamed, fish tank cleaner, bleach, all of these things. Then they said ivermectin was a horse dewormer and all this sort of thing. Well, people I know that regularly smoke cigars or regularly partake in nicotine products, whether they're oral nicotine products or vapes, none of them got COVID, including me. And then you start wondering, was there some sort of order or instruction that said stop people taking these products because it will stop them getting COVID, which means they'll have to have the vaccine, which was supposed to stop them getting COVID. Right?
It's interesting with that because I've sort of shifted a bit on that because originally I'd be going, you look at large organisations just from a university point of view, and the university's out to get me. I was like, no, they're not. We're actually functionally useless. We're not capable of doing that. And so, I'm generally against those sort of theories on the fact that, most organisations and companies and then governments are generally so useless that they can't even do anything. But yeah, you're right. There was more going on. It seemed to be more going on there. So, maybe I have to revise my initial position there.
I mean, you've mentioned in the forward too that we've got a legal framework here. And all of these little anecdotes are leading to this, right? Where we have a Human Rights Act, we've got a Bill of Rights Act, and we've got an Education Act. It's called the Education and Training Act, which all protect, supposedly, set out our rights and our freedoms and safeguarding for everybody what is the rule of law around things, right? We have a right to not only speak, but a right to receive information as well. And in the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 6 years, what we've seen is an abrogation of all of those laws by politicians who said, well, no, we don't think we should have to follow the law. We're going to override it, or we're going to just bypass it. And there's been court cases that shows that some of the decisions made during COVID, et cetera, that academics were pushing publicly to do these things were actually illegal. And if you've got a government, as you've said, that's willing to break the law for what they determine is a bigger good, right, or a better reason that it's okay to do that, then why have the laws in the first place? And again, we come back to this academic freedom, where the Education and Training Act specifically says that you are the critic and conscience of society, and therefore your freedoms need to be protected more than anybody else in a job, essentially, right?
And that's why at the moment, the law part is so important. So when people put up and say, hey, we want a discussion around the law, like the stuff around the Treaty of Waitangi is interesting in that regard. It's like, it's not a threat to anything. It's just like, we're a social democracy. We'll have a robust discussion around this, and we'll get to where we get to, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. There's nothing evil about that. There's something good, fundamentally good about that. But as a country, we've failed to have the balls, basically, to engage in that, which I think's a shame, because it's obviously contentious and people have different views. But gosh, that's the whole point of a social democracy.
Well, we've reached a point now where people are held up in the media as being brave for speaking out, when speaking out should be the default, right? You should be able to do that at any time, but now they're held up as being brave speaking out, which means everybody else are a bunch of cowards, right? I mean, that's a logical conclusion.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I've always spoken freely. It's what's got me in trouble a few times, but you've got to take your lumps and fight your corner. And I've always been taught to fight my corner. I mean, that's the one great thing my mother taught me. It's all right, Cam, to have opinions, but you better be able to back them up.
So, how do you feel about that? Because you probably see, people on the other side coming at you, and you're okay with that, are you?
Well, they can come at me. I don't know. People are entitled to their opinions. I always say they're like noses. Everyone's got one, right? But when we don't all live in a society, I'm left-handed. You can't make me right-handed. Right? You can't say, no, that's it, we're going to regulate and say no left-handed people. Because that's basically what they're trying to do with free speech. They're trying to say, well, we don't like your opinion, so you have to be quiet. Well, when someone says it to me, I just say, get stuffed. I get people on Twitter or X, they come at me and say, oh, you're irrelevant. And I reply to them every time, and yet here you are.
Yeah.
Arguing with an irrelevant person. What does that make you?
Yeah. But that's just the point. You could be irrelevant, but big deal.
Well, that's your opinion. Right?
Yeah.
I could be irrelevant. That's your opinion. You're entitled to that. And you know what? I'll defend you having the opinion, even though it's wrong, right? Yeah. You can have that opinion and I'll defend it, but will you defend my right to be right?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is no, they won't, because they're censorious.
Yeah.
And, I think this report and you speaking out in the report are very important, that we actually learn these things. But what scares me, and it does scare me, because if you lose the right to freedom of speech, and if academics lose the right to their academic freedom to speak freely, then we're starting the slippery slope towards totalitarianism, and we've seen how quick we can get there. And if you start saying we need these restrictions because someone might get hurty feelings, we've got a problem, and it's a big problem. And what comes from that next, we don't need to know what comes next, because we've seen what comes next. We've seen it in communist societies. We've seen it under fascism. in various guises, Chile, Nazi Germany, Italy, Spain, etc. We don't need to guess what comes next. We know what comes next, and none of that's good.
I 100% agree with that, because you would always look, especially as a younger man, you'd look at societies of past, and you just quoted several of them there, and you just go, how could that happen? I just can't imagine how that would happen. Well, after COVID, now we know.
It happens in small steps is how it happened.
Yeah.
I visited Israel in 2014, and I went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum there, because I'd always wondered, how on earth did this happen? How did Jewish German citizens let this happen to them? And the museum tells you how it happened, because the entire museum is the journey of a Jewish person through. So you walk through these different hallways, and every time you cross a bridge, that's a piece of legislation that was enacted, and then you end up in the world that happens after that. And you go and look at the display of that, and then you cross the bridge back onto the other side of the museum, and that was a piece of legislation. And that steps you through, and you realize how it didn't start with the death camps. It started by saying you need to wear a gold star. And then it took a little step further, and 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 now you're having a shower. And that's what happens when you let – that's the slippery slope that everyone scoffs at, but it's real. You let those things happen. If you don't stand up and say, no, we're not going to tolerate that, then – and if you let that happen, then you'll let the next step happen as well.
Yeah, so because it's interesting with that, because I'd been thinking about that a lot as well, and thinking, well, because of modern social media, surely there's just a big enough group of people that will just go, nah, screw this, and will never happen. But that didn't seem to be the case. It actually seemed to push it even further the other way, because I keep thinking that the modern information age means this could never happen again, but I'm actually not convinced about that.
No, we saw it could happen again.
Yeah.
And people don't like me saying that, you can't compare COVID with the Holocaust. Well, we can, because the Holocaust didn't happen just immediately. It took place over a number of years. And we saw that slide. Well, okay, you need to stay at home. Well, hang on, the Health Act says that only if I'm sick do I need to stay. No, we're telling you all need to stay at home. That was the first break of the law. They turned the Health Act upside down and inside out and made it say things and do things that it wasn't intended to do. And the majority of New Zealanders went, okay, I'm all right with that. And it wasn't,
you would see
the people went down to Parliament and said, we're not okay with this, that it all started to unravel.
I think the thing that most sticks in my mind, Cam, and it's a place that we both exercise. I was down Takapuna Beach one day, and the police were then taking a elderly man out of the water, manhandling him, hands behind his back, because he was swimming.
How dare he?
The danger of it all. But, honestly, that we could get to that is just, it's an astonishing thing, really.
Totally. But it's important. People like you stand up. James does this research. I'm hoping that the universities take that on board. It's kind of ironic too, because you said AUT was the worst. AUT is also the university that releases the report into the slide in public confidence in the media. Put these two reports together, and here's your problem, right?
Yeah.
Now solve it.
Yeah. On one slightly good side, nothing to do with AUT, but Otago, who I've been roundly critical of for the last several years, at least issued a statement recently around academic freedom and expression and welcoming that. That has to turn into practice, but there's something.
I mean, I've had a run-in with several Otago academics over the years. Some of them even tried to sue me because I called them hurty things. But, I'm still here and still carrying on because we need to live free, and we need to speak freely, and we need to have people like you as academics who speak out. Because if we don't protect those freedoms, if we don't protect your freedoms in academia, then we're actually not protecting our own freedoms in the end.
Yeah, and that is an important thing. Like I don't want to sort of be in defence of the university because we haven't really behaved ourselves for a decade, but we could actually still play a good role in society as a thing.
Totally. I mean, that's a given. Absolutely. Yeah. And, I mean, I think the things this report raises are critical, and we can't just sweep it under the carpet. And that's why, I've had you on the show. That's why I've spoken to James as well, because if we don't talk about these things and raise the awareness amongst the general public, then these reports just slide away as just another academic treatise that we can safely ignore.
True.
All right, Grant, well, thank you so much for your time and sharing why you wrote that forward. I'd really recommend to everybody that they go to the New Zealand Initiative website and download that report. And I'll make sure that we've got a link to it as well on our website, on RCR's website for these interviews. But I really appreciate your time and talking about academic freedom and the importance. And maybe you and I will catch up on Takapuna Beach one morning.
Look forward to it.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers, mate. Bye.
Isn't it interesting to see the correlation between academic freedom and all our other freedoms? Academic freedom enables scientists to propose new ideas, test hypotheses, and advance knowledge, even at the risk of being wrong. If that is lost, then it is our freedoms next. Tell me what you think. Email inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.
It's that time of the show again. It's Olivia's View, and with me now is Olivia Pierson. How are you, Olivia?
I'm great, thanks, Cam. How are you?
I'm always, box of fluffies, always. But you know my role on that. Yeah,
Yep.
Always answer in the affirmative because no one actually cares if you shit.
So true.
What have you got for me today?
Well, I'm following on, Cam, with academic freedom because this has been a absolute storm in Britain over the last 5 years, and I'll describe what happened over there because they got a great win and then it all got lost. But I'll describe what happened. There has been a monumental fight going on in England over the last few years regarding freedom of speech on university campuses. After so many controversial speakers being deplatformed at prestigious universities like Cambridge and Oxford, you might remember that Jordan Peterson was banned from Cambridge by the perennial umbrage mob in 2019. Well, after student societies at Oxford University deplatformed the history professor Selina Todd and a former Home Secretary Amber Rudd in 2020, the Secretary of State for Education at that time, Gavin Williamson, warned that the government would move to defend free speech if universities failed to do so themselves. Universities did fail, and a new bill was introduced titled the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which Her Majesty Elizabeth II announced in her speech from the throne for the opening of Parliament in May 2021, when Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister. Then the bill became a ferocious storm as amendments were sought and woke lobby groups were outraged, and wording was quibbled over by the once noble House of Lords, which brings to mind a scene from that acclaimed movie about manly integrity, A Man for All Seasons, where Thomas More shouts at Lord Norfolk, "The nobility of England would have snored through the Sermon on the Mount, but you'll labour like scholars over a bulldog's pedigree." Anyway, after the legislation was announced by the Queen, UK university student unions wondered out loud whether rabid Holocaust deniers or so-called Islamophobes would now be welcomed onto their campuses as speakers and actually be able to speak. They had become so used to successfully deplatforming people with speech they found repugnant, including people such as philosophy professor Dr. Kathleen Stock, who was forced to resign from Sussex University because of her unpopular views on natural biological sex, which the troons and trans activists considered to be evil heresy in their shitty little book of woke. The bill insisted on a statutory tort, Clause 4, which protected the right to sue the universities for breaching any individual's freedom of speech, both students and faculty members. Universities, colleges, and student unions in England would now have a legal duty to promote freedom of speech or be hit financially if they did not. The term respect, as in respect a person's religious beliefs, was amended to tolerate the beliefs and opinions of others. The upshot of all this was that the previous Conservative government managed to get through the legislation, and the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 was given royal assent by King Charles III. I'm sure His Majesty must have done that through his famously gritted teeth. The Act required universities to robustly promote and protect freedom of speech on their respective campuses through a code of practice. But interestingly, Cambridge University wrote up their code of practice in a much different manner than did Oxford University. The Committee for Academic Freedom, the CAF, wrote this all up in detail and used Cambridge University as the ultimate exemplar for all colleges and higher education to follow. Quote, "The University of Cambridge has developed a strong new code of practice. It refers in detail and accurately to the main legislation governing freedom of speech. It states unambiguously that protecting freedom of speech ensures that staff and students may be exposed to research, course material, discussion, or speakers' views that they find offensive, contentious, or unacceptable, but are nonetheless within the law." Unquote. In contrast to Cambridge University's Code of Practice, the CAF cites the differing Oxford University Code of Practice, in particular on 5 points. The first and main one being, the Oxford Code states that as an integral part of our commitment to freedom of expression, we will take steps to ensure that all exchanges of views happen respectfully. Academic freedom requires tolerance, not respect. Indeed, it requires the ability to say civilly that one does not respect a person's work or ideas. Respect implies a positive esteem, whose absence toleration permits. Enforced respect is intolerance. The CAF believes that the University of Oxford's Code of Practice on freedom of speech is an instructive example for other universities of what not to do. So the great University of Cambridge came out as a true bastion of freedom of speech, welcoming this legislation to promote freedom of expression on campuses in England, and about high time too. But, alas, as soon as Kierstead became Prime Minister, this important act was all made moot. The legislation, even though it received royal assent, due to roll out fully on August the 1st of this year, was swiftly shelved by the new Labour government. I repeat, the entire act has been completely abandoned, even though it became law. In fact, the new Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, said she will now consider repealing it. Arif Ahmed, a former Cambridge professor and the first ever appointed government free speech czar, and a libertarian committed to academic free speech, had spent a whole year designing a new complaints scheme because of the Act, which would have allowed visiting speakers to lodge appeals if they were no-platformed. Cambridge University's new Code of Conduct will ensure visiting speakers are allowed to express controversial or unpopular views within the law, and that protest must not shut down debate. The powerful Russell Group conglomeration even said it would consider covering security costs for any controversial speakers in any of their 24 associated universities, including Cambridge and Oxford. But now, Cambridge said other elements of its free speech plans had been paused pending further clarity following the Education Secretary's decision to halt the new legislation. In other words, they're watching what is happening to British protesters and social media users with the arrests and imprisonings that are intended to be an example and send a message that free speech will not be tolerated in Stalin-Starmer's Britain, and Cambridge University now doesn't know what to do next. So that's the backdrop of the fight for academic freedom in the UK over the last 5 years and throughout the COVID era. It was a total win for free speech with the new legislation, then a sudden total loss due to the new Labour government. And in New Zealand, according to Dr. James Kierstead, author of the report Unpopular Opinions, Academic Freedom in New Zealand, with the New Zealand Initiative think tank, whom you've just heard interviewed with Cam, Dr. Kierstead wrote, "The report is, quote, a thoroughly documented examination of the state of academic freedom at our universities, together with an analysis of the main threats to academic freedom in this country at present," unquote. The report states 4 main threats to our academic freedom: liberal progressives, the CCP, the Treaty of Waitangi, and sex and gender. We all know the Troons are abominable on this front regarding the thugs' veto and what it and they have brought to culture. Mega disgusting grossness from A to Z. I'm sick of even hearing about it. So unlike what Britain has gone through before Stalin-Starmer ruined it, with no legislation to address freedom of speech properly in academia or anywhere else, the New Zealand Institute think tank have left any idea about new legislation up to the Free Speech Union to consider. Does New Zealand need new legislation like Britain embarked upon in order to actively promote and protect free speech in our universities? I think it may. And that is Olivia's view for The Crunch this week.
You know, Olivia, I think you're right there that we do need to have the government pick this up and force the universities to have some sort of free speech czar that looks at academic freedom and all that, because in my monologue earlier in the show, I said that academic freedom is closely related with free speech, that if they come for academic freedom, eventually they come for free speech and then they come for all your others, and that academic freedom is in fact the canary in the coal mine, and the poor little canaries lying on the bottom of the cage, feet up, gasping for breath at the moment.
Yep, you're right. If it goes in the universities completely, as it has done. And I mean, what's all this nonsense about the CCP being so effective? I mean, I believe the report. I believe that that's the thing.
It's dead right. The CCP, Anne-Marie Brady has been consistently victimised by the CCP operatives. And, remember the National Party had Jiang Yang as an MP who was, who trained spies in a military university. So they are into politics. They're into the universities because the Chinese, we can deride them all they like, but, they've got a 1,000-year plan. We've got a 3-year plan. They have a 1,000-year plan, and part of that 1,000-year plan is to infect universities with their ideology so that they end up with a whole bunch of people who are civil servants and key business people who subscribe to their ideology. And that's not something that we should be liking. We shouldn't be like Don Brash and Helen Clark and John Key cuddling up to the Chinese. We should be saying, this is our country, you play by our rules, or you can leave.
Yeah, that's right. I noticed that the recommendation was to divest and or review CCP-linked programs in the report. And I think that's a really good idea. But why has it become so hard for us to tell other countries where to get off?
Well, they tell us what to do. So,
yeah.
But again, like the report, though, was a little bit soft on that, saying, we need to – everything that comes from China is linked to the CCP.
Yeah.
You need to remember that, right? It doesn't matter. That might be a military university associated to the PLA, but that university there, the top people in that university are senior CCP people. So any university is controlled and operated for the benefit of the CCP.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they don't have free enterprise in the same sense that we do. So they don't have free anything.
Free enterprise either. We've got a managed enterprise where politicians meddle on things and
true. try to regulate it every step of the way. So,
all right, Olivia, thank you for your view, and
you're welcome, Cam.
We'll be back with another Olivia's view soon.
Okay, great. Thanks. See ya.
People are struggling to have conversations and connect with others that they don't completely agree with on every topic. And I think that's probably the biggest problem that we need to try and solve, is how after all this division and after all this separation do we end up bringing people together again, and what does unity really look like?
New Zealand faces some pretty big issues. First one is COVID and the aftermath. There's no getting away from that. Second is racial division. It's been ginned up and it's dangerous. Another issue that maybe people haven't got their head around yet is digital currency. What form does that take? Is it programmable? Will it be used to manipulate behaviour and patterns of behaviour? Those questions need to be asked and answered.
How can you have fair, open, democratic government by people who are appointed? It's a ridiculous idea. And if that idea is taken to its zenith, then this country is in real trouble, because democracy, one person, one vote, where every vote is of equal value, has got to be the foundation of a modern New Zealand.
What's true, what's not true, how our kids are to be educated. And, I have a great fear for the future. I think we know from history where this could end up.
Now it's time for Cam's Buddies. This week, we'll find out what they think about Christopher Luxon and his recent discovery of his backbone. My producer has them all lined up and ready to go. Let's go now to Cam's Buddies. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Miles. Good to have you back.
Hello, how are you today, Cam?
Fantastic as usual. I've got a really good one for you.
Excellent.
You can cut loose on this one. So in the last couple of weeks, we've seen Christopher Luxon showing a bit of spine, or if you want to talk in the vernacular, he's found his balls. He told Chloe Swarbrick in Parliament that he believes that Maori ceded sovereignty, to gasps of horror from the agitators in Parliament. And then he went to a local body conference and told them there's no more money, you need to cut your cloth and start acting responsibly because the ratepayers are sick of it, which is kind of unheard of. And then on Tuesday, he stood up for Shane Jones in Parliament when Christopher Hickins decided to question the Prime Minister and saying, Shane Jones has called this Judge Cheryl Gwynne, a communist judge, and also when he was questioned, he said it's a matter of fact and an adjective. And Luxon came out and said that Jones was being descriptive, not critical. This is astonishing. This is like 4 weeks now of Christopher Luxon showing a bit of spine. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt and say this, that being a politician in Parliament is quite different from anything corporate that Christopher Luxon may well have known before, and perhaps the training wheels have come off. Perhaps Christopher Luxon has discovered what Parliament is actually about. And I'd say one other thing. He's been under some pressure, I would think, whether it be personal pressure or whether it be party pressure, from the poor results that he has been garnering in the opinion polls. So I'm prepared to look on the bright side and say, well, maybe the training wheels have come off. Maybe he is actually getting to understand what the cut and thrust of politics is all about.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows I'm not a big fan of Christopher Luxon. I've always considered him to be a very, very light version of John Key, and perhaps not even in the right party. But I'm looking at these three things and I'm starting to think maybe I've underestimated this man. maybe he actually does have a backbone and some, decent-sized testicles rather than what it appeared to be a couple of wizened raisins. This is ballsy from him to go up against, the so-called conventional wisdom that sovereignty was never ceded. It's ballsy to say to the troffers in local government, no, enough's enough, you're not getting any more money from central government. And it's certainly ballsy to stick up for a minister who thinks a judge is a commie, which he is, by the way, but, that's another matter.
Well, hold on a sec. What was so wrong about speaking the truth? Have we got so jaded by the Ardernist regime that now speaking the truth is somewhat surprising? I see that Luxon's speaking the truth. Every one of those things is about Luxon speaking the truth. And we want to hear more of it. We want to hear the truth. We don't want to hear some glossy, wokist agenda. We want the councils to be spending their money on the basics. Come on. And the treaty was signed with a whole bunch of disparate tribes. And, of course they ceded sovereignty to the British sovereign. Of course they did. There's no question in my mind. And and for Luxon sticking up for Shane Jones, well, that's just another example of someone who's prepared to speak the truth. Shane Jones is. He set the example. Maybe Luxon's training wheels have come off and he's decided that it's not going to hurt him. In fact, it's going to benefit him if he speaks a little bit more of the truth.
Oh, yeah. Do you think maybe Luxon's seeing some internal polling that says most people have thought that he's a bit meh, a bit ordinary, and would like him to take a stand, and he's decided to take that on board and start to muscle up? Because that's what it looks like.
I think that's true.
As an insider, that's what I'm reading into this, that he's had some polling that shows that he needs to make a mark. He's seen that Winston and Shane Jones and others aren't unafraid of, and it's not costing them any support to have a wallop at the wokies, or bad Maoris or whatever that he likes to think. And I think he's maybe thinking, he's a pragmatic businessman. He's thinking, well, it works for them. Well, I'll give it a go with me and see how we go.
Yep, and just like I said, I think the training wheels have come off. And, politics is quite unlike anything in the corporate world. And, as I said, I'm prepared to give the man benefit of the doubt. And if he's got a modicum of intellect, which I think he probably has, he has probably taken a little bit too long for my personal comfort to work out where he should be heading in the cut and thrust of politics. But certainly, to make some headway, it's not called the cut and thrust of politics for nothing. He has to cut through the rubbish, the wokist agendas. He has to speak the truth. And I say good on him. And I say, may there be much more of this to come.
Well, it's certainly, it's gobsmacking, really. I'm almost lost for words on it. That's why I decided to get the buddies to talk about it tonight, because I'm just staggered. If only Luxon had shown the side of himself prior to the election, National might have got over 40%, and we'd have a much stronger government than what we've got now. I think that's true. I think that is true. He didn't have the formula correct, but to his credit, if this is the direction he has changed to, I believe it's the right one. I believe it's the right one for the supporters that voted him in, and I believe it's the right one for the country. We have to stop this wishy-washy wokist agenda. We have to stop pandering to half-truths and mistruths. And if Luxon stands up and says and speaks the truth, so much the better for all of the voters and for the country as a whole. Well, I agree with you, Miles, but we can have a think about this, and maybe we'll revisit it again next week. But it certainly got me thinking that perhaps I might have misjudged Christopher Luxon. But anyway, well, we'll see what the other buddies have to say about it. Thanks for calling in.
All good, Cam. You have a good one. We'll catch you later.
Thank you. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Paul. Great to have you back.
Great to be back, Cam, and it's a great day.
It is a fantastic day. And you know, something's happened today that adds to a little list of things that I'm going to run past you. And then I'm going to ask you what you think about Christopher Luxon. So last week, he was sticking it to the local government conference and telling the councils, there's no more money from the central government. Get your books in order. Listen to the ratepayers, and don't come to us asking for a bailout. And then in Parliament, he told Chloe Swarbrick that he believed that Maori ceded sovereignty, to much gnashing and wailing going on from the usual suspects. And then on Tuesday this week, he's come out and defended Shane Jones for calling a sitting judge, Cheryl Gwynne, a communist. Now, he said that Shane Jones was just being descriptive, and Shane Jones is right. I mean, she used to be a member of the Trotskyist Action group in New Zealand, clear communism. And I'm sitting here thinking, I'm kind of gobsmacked. As you know, I'm not particularly fond of Christopher Luxon. I think he's a bit sort of wet. But I'm starting to see a bit of backbone in him, standing up for things. I'm interested to see what you think.
Well, starting with the council saying, all the councils coming and saying, oh, we want money for this and we want money for that. And so instead of the ratepayers of the area paying for it and the taxpayers pay for it, I'm very concerned that councils have decided to talk in their council meetings about global boiling and all these things that are happening, and so that they want the councils to take away road access and put in bicycle access. And like you see them spending a lot of time on the Auckland waterfront, and you think, oh, they're widening the roads, but they're not. They're narrowing the roads and taking away the car parks. And then you've got bicycle accesses there. And then I see down in Wellington, they wanted some big flash arena, which I think they got. And but that's sort of a lot of ratepayer money. And so that when the roads have got potholes in them, when the water doesn't work as well as you could, we're running out of water, and when we're running out of the basic things that the council needs, but we're doing woke things and making sure we've got DEI and all that sort of thing going at maximum rate, I think he's very accurate in saying, don't come to me with the begging bowl, do your basics, and then you'll have enough money. And these different councils are going and seeing him saying, we don't want to give our people a rate increase, but we want to do 10 stupid projects as well as the 3 that we're going to do half right instead of doing the 3 things properly and ignoring the stupid projects. And then when I see that he's calling a judge, and I think Chris Hipkins was going on about how dare he say this and how dare he say that. And then when Christopher Luxon came back and said he's being descriptive, not insulting, I thought that was just top shelf. I thought, well, that's a fact, especially if she was, as a youngster, a member of the Communist Party or whatever, the Trotsky group.
Yeah, she belonged to the Trotskyist Socialist Action League during the 70s and 80s. So this isn't a fleeting thing. This is a couple of decades of being a commie. Well,
yeah,
I don't know about you, but I've never met a unionist or a commie that was a commie in the youth that kind of changes. They kind of don't. They're indoctrinated into this rubbish ideology that's caused untold misery around the world. And so I think Shane Jones is brave for saying it, but I'm sitting here gobsmacked that Christopher Luxon didn't use sort of weasel words to try and get around it. He said, no, it's descriptive, not critical. And he's dead right.
Yes.
It's a refreshing change.
And I think he's also he's saying that they're making it a bit more difficult for one group of people to get better access to the seabed and foreshore than another. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not unhappy with that either. I think if a group of our citizens in this country have preferential rights over another group of citizens, I think that needs to stop. And if, even though he's saying he doesn't want the treaty rules defined necessarily, and that bill might die, he is saying he's making things a little bit more difficult because things, well, not difficult, but a bit more accurate of how things should be. And so when I heard that he was making it a bit more difficult for people to have free-for-all at some of the different foreshore and seabed legislation, I'm thinking, well, that can't be all bad.
No, it can't be all bad. I'm actually thinking we're seeing a transition here, I think, with Christopher Luxon, from someone who was afraid of his own shadow to someone who's prepared to put draw a line in the sand or a stake in the ground on particular things. And I think it's refreshing. And as I said, I have not been particularly fond of Christopher Luxon or any of his policies or previous public statements, but I'm starting to like the guy, and it's worrying me a bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give fair due. So if he's doing good things, I think we should encourage, and if he's doing stupid things, I think we should mention. But I also thought he's doing well when he's saying we need more supply of energy. So I was watching a TV interviewer try to terrorise him that the power company's making too much profit. And I'm thinking, but profit's not a bad word. Someone's got to invest in the infrastructure. You can't invest in the infrastructure if you don't make any money. And then he was saying, well, he's trying to get more energy because if 85% of our energy is renewable and 15% relies on coal and gas, and we stop anyone from drilling and mining for coal and gas, and then we have to import coal and all this stupid stuff, they wouldn't let him get a sentence in on the TV. They kept overshooting him, going back to the profit, like it's a dirty word. Well, without profit, nothing works. So when people make a profit, everything works. And I'm just thinking, and they're saying, oh, they've doubled their profit last week. Well, did they do that in a day? Don't talk stupid. I mean, the reporter was an idiot, in my belief, because the fact that they announced the profit of what they've made on a day doesn't mean they doubled it in a day. It means that they've worked hard at doing things. And they're saying when some people's power bill is up $1,000, well, they probably used quite a few units of power to get up to $1,000. And when the government previously said we can't have any more gas exploration, so you can import coal because we want to pretend we're green rather than being green. I mean, it's just got such a worse carbon footprint what they've done. And so by pretending to be green and virtue signalling, the energy power price goes up, and it goes up all around the world. All around the world, if you think, oh, gee, we want to have solar and we want to have wind, well, what we also are saying is we want to triple and quadruple our power price. So the cheap power is hydro or nuclear, hydro, and then gas and coal. All this other stuff is aberrations to look the part but not be the part.
Yeah, I mean, I heard some...
On a windless day at night, there isn't a lot of power being generated, other than if you had a thermonuclear, or if you had hydro, or if you've got burning coal and gas. And it's not as cold during the day when the sun's shining, so the usage happens at night when we're cold. And there's no sun to drive, and when the coldest days are the calmest days, when it's a bit blowy, it's often not as cold because they've blown the clouds away that keep cover and that sort of thing. So anyway, you just look and you think, I'm impressed that Christopher Luxon is starting to take it in small steps, but maybe he's going to be all right.
It's early days, and we can be hopeful, even though you know what my thoughts are on hope.
Yeah.
It's not a good thing, but maybe there's some glimmers of hope here that Christopher Luxon's showing a bit of background and finding out that standing up to these wombles actually is a good thing for his poll numbers.
Exactly. And most people that you talk to are normal. They're not full of this DEI malarkey. Most people don't think that the Harley-Davidson ad was a good one, and now that no one wants to buy a Harley-Davidson because some woke CEO, they're calling for his head, because he's not resonating with what the riders of the Harley-Davidson motorcycle look like. And it's the same thing. When the local government council guys go woke, cost their city a fortune, and ask the government to bail them out, and he's saying, go some guys, this is what you want to be doing. And if he doesn't go woke himself, suddenly New Zealand will be going places.
Yeah, well, we can only hope. And we'll have to talk again next week. Thanks for your call, Paul.
Okay, thanks. Bye for now.
See you. Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Jack.
Hey, Cam.
I got a tricky one for you this week. Given your own personal views, I kind of know, but this one's going to be a curveball, so just bear with me. I've just got to run through a couple of scenarios for you, and then I'll ask you a question, and I'll hear your pearls of wisdom. So last week, we saw an amazing sight. We saw Christopher Luxon speaking to the local government meeting, the annual meeting that they had in Wellington, and he told them all they needed to cut their cloth, that there was no more money, that they couldn't come to the government to bail them out, and they better sort out, focusing on things like rubbish and water and the things that ratepayers actually want rather than, cycleways and other woke bullshit. And then he followed that up with a bit in Parliament where Chloe Swarbrick from the Greens, the Loopy Greens, was asking him if he thought that Maori had ceded sovereignty. And he said, yes, I do think that. I would have thought of never of hearing that from his coming out of his mouth, but we did. And then Tuesday this week, he's come out defending Shane Jones for calling a judge a commie judge or a communist judge, which, of course, is a statement of fact in this case, because this judge was a member of the Trotskyist Socialist Action Group back in the 70s and 80s. And I'm sitting here wondering, is this the same Christopher Luxon that stood in the election, who had all of the spine of a jellyfish and the testicles that looked like a couple of, dried out raisins? And I'm wondering, has he found his spine and his balls? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I was expecting you to come up with something far more interesting, like Philip Polkinghorne, something where I could really get my teeth in.
I'm not interested in a lurid court case of. I will say one thing about Philip Polkinghorne. Seems he has an eye for the girls, but we'll leave that joke hanging.
Jesus. Well, this is quite prophetic, actually, because my dog was taking me for a walk tonight round the block, and a neighbour up the road was being taken by his dog for a walk concurrently on the other side. And we got to talking, of course, as you do. And how are you and all this sort of stuff? Oh, I'm miserable. You know why? And then he got onto politics. Oh, God. Wimpish Prime Minister. If it wasn't for the ACT Party and New Zealand First, he'd be an even bigger wimp. And it got me thinking, and I've said all this before, the problem he has is he's a born-again Christian but doesn't have any fun, I believe. And he doesn't want anyone else to have fun. The first thing he did when he got into Air New Zealand was take all of the liquor out of the boardroom. We're not having fun. And I think this is projected. He's a sycophant of John Key, who was the biggest wimpish Prime Minister we've ever had, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And he's done a few things. They're only words. He's come up with a few words to appease people, probably more his partners in crime, Winston and so forth, have said, come on, you've got to say something here. I think he's being driven by them. No, I don't think he's grown any balls. I think the strongest drink that he takes is probably milk, and I'm sure he slips a bit of estrogen in that when he drinks it. So that's my short answer.
I knew I could rely on you to say something completely outrageous that all the listeners will write in and give me a absolute shellacking. That how can you have someone like Jack on the show? Well, Jack's a mate, and all opinions are valid. But I kind of was on the same page as you with where Luxon was at. I'm not so too. I don't really care that he's a born again Christian. I'm a Christian myself, and a few of your mates are Christians as well. But we kind of have fun though, don't we?
We've got to have fun. That's the missing component. But I reiterate, if he didn't have the ACT Party and New Zealand First in there, what sort of a wimp would he be? Even worse than he is now. And I think, what the hell?
Yeah, well, you never leave me wondering what you think, Jack, and that's why I love you as a mate.
Well, that was actually what my neighbour up the road thought. I was just agreeing.
I agree. All right, Jack, thanks for your comments there.
I think our dogs thought the same thing too.
Probably, and then showed what they thought on the nearest lamppost.
Yes. No, my dog's a female, so they don't do that. They sniff the lamppost.
All right then, Jack. Thanks for coming in. We'll talk again next week.
See you, Cameron. Bye.
Welcome to Cam's Buddies, Jimmy. Good to have you back.
Thanks, Cam. Happy Thursday. What have you got for me this week?
What I've got for you this week, so I've just got to run through a couple of things, and then I'll ask you what you think about these scenarios.
Okay.
Bear with me. Last week, Christopher Luxon went to the local government conference and told them to pull their heads in, start listening to the ratepayers, and there's no more money from central government. That's example one.
Good.
Example two is he stood up in Parliament and told Chloe Swarbrick that he believed that Maori ceded in sovereignty, that Parliament was sovereign, and that's the end of that argument. And then Tuesday this week, he sticks up for Shane Jones, who called a judge a communist, and he said, well, it's not insulting, it's actually descriptive. And I'm sitting here thinking, has this man who exhibited all the tendencies of a jellyfish in the election managed to grow a spine and find a set of testicles that are larger than a couple of shriveled raisins?
Mate, he finally has grown a spine and is telling it like he should be. Telling these woke left commies to go and jump in the lake. He should have, but the problem, he obviously didn't do this for the election because he'd get attacked by our woke media. But he obviously feels safe enough with the polling and the way things are going that he can actually start to act like this. It's fantastic to have a leader that leads, Well,
what about Christopher Hipkins?
It's amazing.
Stood up in the Parliament and asked Luxon if he thought this was a good thing for a minister to be saying. I'm sitting there wondering, mate, someone needs to tell you a few things. But now we all know that Hipkins defends commies.
Oh, we know that. He defended Arden. She's a blatant communist. But also Hipkins said that Maori didn't cede sovereignty. So who's he saying? Is he saying that the Crown isn't sovereign now, which is insane for someone so high in the government? Borderline massively problematic. So if Hipkins' theory went ahead, how would our government look? Would we have double government? Where would the tax money go and who would make the final decisions on things? Imagine the state of the place.
Well,
at least
the question I'd ask then is if Maori didn't cede sovereignty and you believe that, Christopher Hipkins, let's have an election and we'll have New Zealand First Act and National saying, yeah, no, they did. And you can campaign on, no, they didn't. And we'll see what the election says. And I suspect that Christopher Hipkins might get shellacked pretty badly.
Oh, he would. But it just appears to me that Labor haven't learned anything from the election loss. They're even worse than they were potentially. You'd think they might come back to the centre.
No, I don't think they will.
I thought Hipkins would be gone now, but he was buoyed on by the poll result that put them on 30. It saved him. If it was one down, he would have been gone. If it was one on the 30, he's safe. But I encourage everyone to read Ron Crosby's The History of the Musket Wars book. That will explain a lot about the context around the treaty. It wasn't New Zealand wasn't a particularly nice place around between 1830 and 1840, especially for Māori. It was terrible, and the treaty was a way to bring peace. I mean, I'm guessing they didn't completely sign over their sovereignty as a direct action, but they needed something to stop the Musket Wars. And we can't get back in time now. You can't have two governments. The country will cease to function. It's bad for everyone, including Maori. So these guys need to stop using the treaty for power. It's insane. it's going to stuff us. So good on Luxon for standing up for us. He must be doing polling that shows us to be good. He's very poll-driven.
Do you think his changes come about because the polling was showing that Winston and Shane and David Seymour were, holding their numbers, that they were saying these outrageous things, and everybody else in the public was going, yeah, on you, mate. We agree with you. And he's decided, well, I better have a piece of that because National's not going anywhere. They're just sort of stable. Perhaps he's had an idea that it might be best for him to come out and start putting a stake in the ground.
Well, I very much think that's the case. I mean, I'm guaranteed they're looking at the polling on this. He's just so careful about what he says. But I think National will be fine with its polling numbers as long as the economy comes right. And it's really quite good for New Zealand to have David and Winston that can do the heavy lifting without affecting the soft centre vote, Yeah. Whereas the Greens, Labour is trying to out-green the Greens. It seems insane. Whereas on the right, we've got quite a National, which is real economic focus, and then you've got the fringy stuff with ACT and Winston Peters. So the right's in quite a good position for the next sort of 5 years, I'd say. Whereas, for Chris Hipman to become Prime Minister, you've got to have the Greens in the Maori Party. Who's going to vote for that? Not the soft centre.
No.
So I think as long as the economy comes good, which it really needs to. We've spoken about that last week or the week before. The National will be fine. Maybe Luxon can show us who he really is instead of being this woke jellyfish trying to please that really frail soft centre.
Yeah,
good on him. I'm so happy with him.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. I'm just thinking maybe I got this fella wrong, and maybe we're starting to see the first signs of a backbone growing there, and that this is a pleasing development. But I'm also a little bit reticent to say, good on you, mate, until he shows a bit more stickability on these things, that he doesn't, in the face of relentless left-wing media pressure, start fighting on his position.
Yeah, but to be fair, Kim, he took the electorate off Jacinda Ardern, and she had made us just this weak-minded, mollycoddled, baby nation state, and he had to gently take us off it, and then, move us. He's done a good job. New Zealand was in such a terrible state. Everyone forgets how bad it was, and hopefully by the end of this term or the end of the next term, we can get back to how we used to be when people actually want to succeed and do well for themselves and don't need to rely on the state. Just the fringes can rely on the state. Anyone else is getting on with it. And politicians can be more robust because people can handle it.
Yeah.
Whereas Ardern just made us this really weak place. It was terrible. And I think that
terribly
good on Luxon. He really gently did it, and he's sort of getting stronger as the New Zealand sort of slowly recovers from the 6 years of the communist regime.
Totally.
And she stuffed the place so bad she has to live out of the country. It's not a good thing for Ardern. It's not. It doesn't speak well of her that she can't be at home. And when she does, it has to be secret because of the abuse. It just shows how horrendous it was.
Well, that's right. She didn't read the room, but anyway, that's too bad. You make your bed, you got to lie in it as politicians. And all too often, though, politicians don't suffer any consequences for their poor decision-making or their bad choices, when they're in government. And she is suffering consequences, and that's as it should be. And it's too bad.
Absolutely.
All right,
you can't.
Jimmy, better let you run off to sort out the kids.
Okay. Thanks, Cam. See you next week.
As always, it's interesting to see what the person on the street thinks. And yet again, today was no different. I wonder if perhaps we should send these chats to Christopher Luxon. Tell us your thoughts on this topic by emailing inbox@realitycheck.radio or text to 2057.
You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
And now it's time for the whale bag. Some general feedback. Graham writes and says, you probably are in a good position to find this out. I suspect the COVID experience may have cost somewhere approaching 0.4 trillion or $300 billion between government spending, borrowings, business debt increase, and private individual losses. On top of that goes the cost of increased illness, disease, regardless of cause. It's quite different, it seems. The misery caused in many houses as a result of the COVID policies. A lot of money. Associate Minister of Health Casey Costello joined me to discuss her decision to focus on the demand for smoking rather than chase the white elephant of illegal supply. Brett writes and says, aren't we just replacing one harmful product with another? So in the future, we'll have to deal with getting people off vaping. Doesn't seem to make sense. An anonymous comment says, can please ask what percentage of the retail price for tobacco is tax? I think it's something like about 60%, but I'll need to check that. I'll get back to you. Now, just listening to Cam's interview with Casey, I'm not convinced about vaping being a better alternative to smoking. There are 5 vape stores within a 2.5 kilometre radius of my house. A little excessive, don't you think? My kids' schools have a real problem with kids vaping in the loos at school. We're talking kids as young as 10. A respiratory specialist has said that the kids are waking in the night to vape and having all sorts of respiratory problems. Yes, it's a parental problem, but let's face it, some parents are useless and some kids are just brats and beat their parents down. It's a tricky topic, but not a one-size-fits-all. And that was from Ruth. I got another comment here, anonymous, says, very interesting, Cam. My son is one of the lawyers who worked for Big Tobacco in New Zealand a few years ago on clarifying and debunking the myth that nicotine is dangerous for you and changing legislation. Many politicians and ill-informed academics criticised him. It's good to see the science is coming through. And he finishes off by saying, Yokatan, Cam. Now, apparently, that's Japanese for I'm glad or that's a relief. Alvin writes and says, great interview with Casey Costello, Cam. What a sensible, straightforward and practical minister. Goodness knows we need a few more politicians who have some common sense like her. Keep up the good work. Anonymous comment says, very disappointing, unprincipled discussion on smoking. The phrase nanny state was not mentioned one single time. No mention of why people actually smoke. Addiction is only part of it. If this fascist government doesn't get pushback on forcing tobacco prices up 5 times, then what happens when they do the same with alcohol, butter, eggs, meat, etc., etc.? Please, let's look deeper to the principles involved, not just pearl-clutching, hand-wringing nanny staters legislating their personal dislike of smoking and smokers. Hear, hear. Janet writes and says, great interview with Casey Costello. She sure is a good woman. I hope she stays in Parliament. Very good final question for Eric Crampton. Thank you. Now, speaking of Eric Crampton, New Zealand Initiative Chief Economist Eric Crampton has followed the ups and downs of the government's smoking policy for years and dialed in to explain what he has discovered. Here's an anonymous comment on that. I've been smoking for about 30 years on and off. I got 50 grams duty-free for $40, whereas the store charges 100 or more. The next generation don't want to smoke, so turn the clock back and stop stealing more tax off the citizens for a product they regulated in the first place. Simon writes and says, we don't know what chemicals are really in cigarettes or vape products. What is in all these products, because it's all very obscure and not labelled for content. My kids vape, cough all the time and feel kind of awful, but they're hooked on it and think it's all okay, so keep going. I worry about all this stuff and the devilish motives behind it all. Anonymous comment says, this morning we listened to the replay of you interviewing Eric Crampton. I watched a very interesting video of Dr. Brian Ardis talking about the health benefits of nicotine, being nicotine minus the chemicals that are added into cigarettes. I thought it would be great if you can get him on RCR. Well, I'll ask my producer to contact Dr. Brian Ardis and see if we can. Here's another comment. Cam, women don't work less than men. They may not pay as much tax, but women do work that you obviously don't value. Judgy. I work my butt off and don't earn any money, but I save the taxpayers a lot of money with my work. I get less sleep than my husband because my work is essentially infinite. He starts at 6 a.m., finishes at 6 p.m. Approximately, he pays a lot of tax, but he certainly doesn't work more than me. Cam's buddies dial in to share their insight into how real people are experiencing the clear and obvious downturn in the New Zealand economy. And Rick says, I think it was the Greens that wanted plastic bags introduced years ago, so we got rid of paper bags to save the trees. Now it's gone full circle. They are fools. Next up is some feedback from some of my past recent content. Again, Dr. Mari Glover, the Director of Research Excellence with over 25 years in experience in tobacco control and over 100 scientific papers, chatted with me about that. And Sue writes, thanks for your interview with Dr. Mari Glover. Cam, about smoking. Wow, I pride myself on having a healthy skepticism about most things and have to admit I'd never given the area of smoking much thought. With a history of multiple smoking-related harms in my family, including numerous deaths, the smoke-free aim seemed pretty logical to me. Dr. Glover's work and insight is really powerful, and I thoroughly recommend that interview to anyone who didn't catch it. As well as taking a look at the website, voicesofthE5%.nz, powerful stories of real humans who do deserve the respect of being entitled to choose for themselves. Gareth was on my show, who shared what happened when the police knocked on his door over social media posts he made on his supposedly anonymous and now cancelled Knob Oddie account on X. Ian writes and says, I've just been listening to Cam's interview on a pair of plods turning up at Gareth's door about a tweet Gareth posted. I do wonder about how these plods took their orders from presumably a sergeant, just go and harass this joker about his tweet, or was there something else? To serve and protect comes to mind. Regardless, I'm going to harass both Mitchell and Costa when he does retire again about this case, but I'm also interested in how Cam gets on with the same thing. How are you guys going to keep your listeners up to date on how Cam gets on here? Any ideas? We will be keeping up to date. We're just waiting for Official Information Act and Privacy Act requests, but we'll get back to you, Ian. Jan writes and says, since I'm signed up to the National Party as a member, I get to watch Policy Explained once a month with a senior Nat MP, the last one being Mark Mitchell. It was more or less a horse and pony show where they tell you about all the nice things they're doing and avoid all the ones they aren't, that they really should be talking about. They dodge my questions as best they can because those clearly are questioning the things they do not want to talk about. But at the last one on Wednesday, someone did ask what is going on with police knocking on someone's door and sort of accusing them of hate crimes by posts that appeared on Twitter. It was 10 to 15 minutes into the session and the only question, so Tom Rutherford had to ask it, otherwise it would be glaringly obvious that they didn't want to go there. Mark Mitchell responded that the whole thing was a mistake and that he had words with Costa and they, the police, are not going down this path. So this proves to me that our pushbacks work, which is why I get so frustrated with freedom people who won't show up and keep on repeating ad nauseum some miraculous new truth that they've just discovered that nullifies the truth that they were so eager to tell you just a week before. It usually involves one or other dude that spent time in special forces and really knows his shit. Yeah, right. On another note, the Nats are also fundraising by offering lunch with one or other senior MPs to explain what they're doing and gingerly avoiding the things they should be doing. You're lucky if you get one question in, and that is usually sidesteps. There is one scheduled here in Tauranga with the PM at the grand price of $220, which has now been reduced to $125 for local members. My gut feeling is people are no longer showing up because who can be bothered listening to cherry-picked achievements while the real issues are swept under the carpet. And I've received a long email from Mark, who was talking about an article that I wrote on my own site, The Good Oil. But let's read it out anyway. It says, Cam, I totally agree with your blog about lying. Unfortunately, the hallmark of woke ideology is lying. Woke ideology rejects the Bible as a book of myths, therefore it should be discarded. This also includes the Ten Commandments, the very thing on which our laws stemming from Westminster law were created. Therefore, bearing false witness, as stated in the 9th commandment, is to be rejected according to woke ideology, and lying, like all the other abominations spoke of in the Bible, are to be celebrated. This was no more apparent than at the Democratic National Convention held in the United States last week. President Biden has shown the world how woke the Democrats are, from promoting a queer general in the military to hosting Pride Week at the White House. But most notably is what happened at the DNC. Every delegate that spoke mentioned Trump. In fact, his name was mentioned over 300 times, and accompanying that, a string of lies. I had to laugh because when Harris spoke, she implored the crowd that we could not go back to the dark days. Paraphrased, but which days was she referring to? Surely not the Biden-Harris years, because that would be telling the truth. No, she was referring to the Trump years when they had the most secure borders, the lowest inflation rate, booming economy, and largest job growth in their history. It does not take much research to expose the lies that every delegate accused Trump of telling, not to mention Hunter Biden's laptop, the 51 FBI agents, and the Russia collusion myth, and as it happens, RFK Jr. proved it. RFK Jr. was ousted from the Democratic Party. Why? Because he was being truthful about the condition of the Democratic Party. He would not have aligned himself with Trump if he believed that all Trump ever did was lie. Like he said in his address, that he did not agree with everything Trump believed, but there was enough common ground to align himself with Trump and pull out of the race in battleground states. It does not take a genius to see who are the liars and who aren't. The DNC was a Hollywood production of lies and deceit. The love and unity was actually hate and division, and their moving forward is actually a backward step heading towards Marxism and communism. The flip-flopping Harris has done shows that she is incompetent with no solid policies and should not be allowed anywhere near the White House. I love your blogs, Cam, so keep up the good work. And that's the whale bag for this week.
Thanks for tuning in to RCR, Reality Check Radio. If you like what you're listening to, or even if you don't agree with what you're listening to, then get in touch with us now. You can text us with your message to 2057, that's 2057. Or if you'd rather email us, you can at inbox@realitycheck.radio. We would love to hear from you, so get in touch with us now.
That's it for the Crunch this week. It was a bit full on, though, and while we may not care about academic freedom, we really should, because if they come for academic freedom, then we'll come for all our other freedoms. Dr. James Kierstead highlighted the key areas of concern, but my fear is that universities will just shrug and carry on with their censorious behaviours. Professor Grant Schofield is likewise concerned. We really are on a precipice where free speech is most definitely under attack by censorious politicians who really don't like the narrative not being under their control. Olivia was brilliant as usual. Her views are essential listening. And I much prefer just quietly facts over feelings and rational debate over loud sloganeering. Now, I know I said that last week, but after these interviews this week, I think we really need to preserve academic freedom, not the hollowed out shell it has become. Let's hope that this report brings about changes. This station is called Reality Check Radio for a reason. We deal with reality. This show is called The Crunch because we crunch down those issues to give you a better understanding of issues and topics. And that's why we have these discussions here at The Crunch, to get you the in-depth takes that you need. You can keep up with all my shows and indeed all of our shows by using the RCR app, and you can even use the app to stream live. A big thanks for the team that put this together and makes it all work. It's been a real pleasure having you all back this week. I'm loving all your feedback, really enjoying talking to so many people, sharing their thoughts on politics, life, and everything in between. So a big shout out to all of you, and thank you for listening and having faith in me as we continue to explore this beautiful game of politics. Don't forget, email suggestions or comments to inbox@realitycheck.radio, and let's make this show the best political show in New Zealand. Stay tuned for a repeat of Rodney Hyde's Real Talk coming up next, followed by a replay of Truth Speaker with Tobias Tahi. Finally, to finish, a song from Patti Smith called Looking for You. And I was, babe. All these songs are in the Crunch playlist on Spotify, so go find them and enjoy. Looking forward to having you join me again next week for the Crunch with Cam Slater.
You've been listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater. Remember, you can check out the replays for today's show on our website at www.realitycheck.radio/replays. Tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. for more with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.